Welcome to War Sleep Stories. Today, we will be listening to relaxing war stories and sounds to make you fall asleep, but before that, kindly like and subscribe. Thank you.
The story of Operation Hirondelle. Operation Hirondelle, which means swallow in French, was set into motion, an audacious plan to cripple the Viet Minh's logistical lifelines. For years, the Viet Minh, a determined insurgent force, had built a labyrinth of supply caches and hidden strongholds beneath the canopies. The First Indochina War was entering one of its most intense phases, and the French Union forces knew the stakes were rising. The night before the operation, a thick fog settled over the region. French soldiers, accompanied by their Vietnamese counterparts, prepared for a perilous mission that would test their endurance, resilience, and resolve. In the skies above, transport aircraft roared, their payloads of parachute troops ready to descend into hostile territory. These men were led by the charismatic and seasoned officer, Marcel Bigard, a leader known for his unyielding tenacity and tactical brilliance. The operation aimed to strike hard, destroy supply depots hidden in the caves, and retreat before the Viet Minh could mount a counterattack. Unbeknownst to the French, the Viet Minh, though unaware of the exact timing, anticipated such a move. Their scouts roamed the outskirts of Lang Son, reporting every suspicious movement back to their commanders. The stage was set for a deadly dance in the jungle, a clash of strategy, willpower, and survival instincts. The operation would span mere days, but its impact would ripple through the history of the conflict. As dawn broke on July 17, the jungle stirred awake. The birds cried out their warnings, and the air grew heavy with the anticipation of violence. The parachute units waited in their aircraft, each man grappling with his thoughts. Some prayed silently, others double-checked their gear, and a few exchanged nervous smiles. They were drops of water about to be cast into a raging sea, uncertain of their fate but determined to complete their mission. The engines roared as the aircraft approached Lang Son, their shadows dancing over the jungle below. Inside the planes, the soldiers sat in rigid silence, the tension almost tangible. Marcel Bigard moved among them, his sharp gaze meeting theirs. He didn't need to speak, his presence alone was a reassurance. As the red light turned green, the men stood, gripping the static lines of their parachutes. One by one, they jumped into the void. The humid air rushed past them as the dense green canopy rose to meet them. Parachutes blossomed like white flowers in the sky, and soon the soldiers landed with practiced precision. The ground beneath their boots was uneven, the jungle dense and alive with the sound of unseen creatures. The operation had begun. The soldiers quickly regrouped, moving with calculated efficiency toward the identified Viet Minh supply depots. Scouts led the way, their rifles raised and eyes scanning every shadow. The air was thick with humidity, and the men could feel their uniforms clinging to their skin. Every step forward was accompanied by the crunch of leaves and the rustle of undergrowth, each sound a reminder of how exposed they were. As they approached the caves where the caches were hidden, they spotted signs of the Viet Minh's activity, discarded crates, footprints in the mud, and remnants of hastily consumed meals. The tension tightened. Every soldier knew that the enemy could be lurking nearby, waiting to strike. Marcel Bigard ordered the men to fan out and secure the area before they moved closer to their target. In the dim light of the jungle, the soldiers advanced toward the caves. The smell of earth and decay filled their nostrils, a constant reminder of the unforgiving environment. The first cache was discovered hidden deep within a cavern, its entrance masked by thick vegetation. Inside, the soldiers found crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and food, lifelines for the Viet Minh forces. Photographs were taken for intelligence, and the demolition teams went to work. The explosives were set with precision, their fuses lit. As the soldiers retreated to a safe distance, the ground trembled, and a deafening roar echoed through the jungle. Smoke billowed from the caves, marking the destruction of the Viet Minh's hidden arsenal. But the success came at a cost. The sound of the explosions carried far, and it wasn't long before the Viet Minh began to respond. From the shadows, the first shots were fired. Bullets cracked through the air, splintering trees and forcing the French troops to seek cover. The jungle came alive with chaos as the Viet Minh launched their counterattack, their guerrilla tactics catching the French off guard. The soldiers held their ground, returning fire with disciplined bursts. Marcel Bigard moved among his men, his voice cutting through the chaos as he issued orders. "Hold the line. Keep moving," he shouted, his resolve unwavering. The battle raged on, the dense vegetation turning the skirmish into a deadly game of hide and seek. The crack of gunfire echoed through the jungle as the French soldiers held their positions. The Viet Minh, invisible in the dense foliage, fought with an uncanny knowledge of the terrain, their hit-and-run tactics forcing the French to adapt quickly. The French units, though well-trained, found themselves pressed by an enemy that melted into the jungle like shadows. One of the squads, led by Sergeant Pierre Leclerc, advanced cautiously along a narrow trail. The men moved in single file, their rifles at the ready, eyes darting to every rustle of leaves. They reached a small clearing when the ambush came. A hail of gunfire erupted from the trees, and the squad dove for cover. "Get down!" Leclerc yelled, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. The soldiers returned fire, but the Viet Minh had already begun to melt back into the jungle. A young soldier, Corporal Jean Marchand, lay motionless on the ground, his face pale. The squad medic called to him, but it was too late. Marchand had fallen, the first casualty of the operation. Leclerc ordered his men to regroup and push forward. "We can't stop now," he urged. "Every second counts." The soldiers pressed on, the weight of their comrades' death heavy on their minds. The jungle seemed darker now, each shadow a potential threat. The Viet Minh had made their presence known, and the French knew they would strike again. Despite the ambush, the operation pushed forward with unrelenting determination. The French forces uncovered 2 more supply caches hidden deep within the caves near Lang Son. Each discovery came with a mix of relief and urgency. The caches were meticulously documented, and the demolition teams prepared the charges. The caves erupted in thunderous explosions as the charges detonated, sending plumes of smoke and debris into the air. The ground trembled beneath the soldiers' feet, and for a moment, the jungle fell silent. It was a small victory, a strike at the heart of the Viet Minh's logistics. However, with each detonation, the danger grew. The explosions acted as a beacon, drawing more Viet Minh fighters toward the French positions. Captain Marcel Bigard, ever vigilant, issued orders to tighten the perimeter and prepare for an inevitable counterattack. "They'll come at us harder now," he warned his officers. "Stay sharp. No mistakes." The soldiers worked quickly, their movements efficient but tense. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the jungle. The French knew that nightfall would bring even greater challenges. The Viet Minh were masters of nighttime warfare, their familiarity with the terrain giving them a distinct advantage. As darkness descended, the jungle transformed into a different kind of battlefield. The oppressive heat gave way to a damp chill, and the soldiers' senses heightened. Every sound, the chirping of insects, the rustling of leaves, seemed amplified in the eerie quiet. The Viet Minh struck just before midnight. Their attack was swift and coordinated, a barrage of gunfire and grenades that shattered the stillness. The French soldiers, already on edge, responded with disciplined fire, their tracers lighting up the dark. In the chaos, Lieutenant André Vautrin found himself separated from his unit. Crawling through the undergrowth, he could hear the shouts of his comrades and the distinct voices of the Viet Minh calling out orders in Vietnamese. Vautrin's heart pounded in his chest as he navigated the darkness, his rifle at the ready. Nearby, a French heavy machine gun team unleashed a withering hail of bullets, holding back the Viet Minh's advance. The jungle lit up sporadically with the flashes of gunfire, and the smell of cordite filled the air. The night was long and brutal, a test of endurance for both sides. By dawn, the Viet Minh had withdrawn, leaving behind a battlefield littered with spent shells and broken branches. With the morning light came the next phase of the operation, the withdrawal to Loc Binh. The soldiers, weary but resolute, began their trek through the dense jungle. The journey was fraught with danger, the threat of another ambush ever present. Scouts moved ahead, clearing the path and keeping a wary eye on the surroundings. The heat was oppressive, sapping the soldiers' strength as they trudged forward. They carried not only their gear but the weight of the operation's success and the losses they had endured. Corporal Michel Bernard, one of the youngest in the unit, stumbled under the weight of his pack but refused to falter. At Loc Binh, other French units had been deployed to secure a vital river crossing. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair a damaged bridge, knowing it was the lifeline for the retreating forces. Captain Bigard coordinated with the units at Loc Binh, ensuring a smooth passage for his men. As the soldiers reached the river, they were met with a brief moment of relief. The water sparkled under the sunlight, a stark contrast to the darkness they had left behind. But the war was far from over, and the jungle's shadow loomed large behind them. At the heart of Loc Binh, the river crossing stood as a critical lifeline for the retreating French forces. The engineers, under constant threat of Viet Minh attacks, worked with feverish intensity to repair the bridge. The structure, damaged by earlier skirmishes, was their only means of ensuring a safe withdrawal. Captain Marcel Bigard arrived at the site with his men, his commanding presence a source of motivation. "This bridge is our way out," he told the engineers. "We're counting on you." The soldiers formed a defensive perimeter around the area, their weapons trained on the tree line, ready to repel any attack. As the hours ticked by, tension grew. Scouts reported increased Viet Minh activity in the surrounding jungle, and the sound of distant gunfire occasionally broke the uneasy silence. The engineers pressed on, their hands trembling from exhaustion but driven by necessity. By late afternoon, the bridge was ready. The first group of soldiers began to cross, their boots thudding against the wooden planks. The Viet Minh, aware of the French withdrawal, launched a sudden attack. Mortar rounds exploded near the riverbank, and gunfire erupted from the dense vegetation. The French soldiers returned fire, holding the line as their comrades moved across the bridge. The rear guard, tasked with protecting the retreat, faced the full brunt of the Viet Minh assault. Sergeant Pierre Leclerc, still mourning the loss of Corporal Marchand, led his squad with unflinching resolve. "Hold your ground," he shouted over the deafening gunfire. The Viet Minh fighters, armed with rifles and grenades, pushed forward relentlessly. The French soldiers used every available resource to repel the attack. Machine guns rattled, grenades were lobbed into the advancing enemy lines, and the jungle floor became a chaotic battlefield. Amid the chaos, a Viet Minh mortar round struck dangerously close to Leclerc's position, sending debris flying. Dazed but uninjured, he quickly rallied his men. "We can't let them break through," he yelled. Despite their fatigue, the soldiers fought with unwavering determination. The rearguard action bought precious time for the main force to complete their crossing. As the last of the soldiers moved across the bridge, the rearguard began their withdrawal, falling back in a disciplined manner under cover of smoke grenades. The Viet Minh, though determined, could not break their resolve. The French forces regrouped on the far side of the river, where they were met by Group Mobile 5, a mobile unit deployed to assist in the extraction. The soldiers, covered in mud and sweat, were a stark contrast to the fresh reinforcements who stood ready to support them. Captain Bigard conferred with the commanding officer of Group Mobile 5, outlining the situation. "The Viet Minh won't stop," he warned. "We need to move quickly and decisively." The combined forces prepared for the final leg of their withdrawal, knowing the enemy was still on their heels. The soldiers boarded trucks and began their journey toward the coast, where ships awaited their extraction. The convoy moved cautiously, their progress hindered by the rough terrain and the constant threat of ambushes. The Viet Minh, though weakened, continued to harass the French forces, launching sporadic attacks that kept them on edge. As night fell, the convoy reached a temporary camp. The soldiers, exhausted from days of relentless combat, finally had a moment to rest. The campfires flickered in the darkness, and the men shared quiet conversations about home, family, and the comrades they had lost. For many, the reality of the war weighed heavily on their hearts. On July 19, the French forces reached the coast, where ships awaited to take them to safety. The sight of the sea brought a sense of relief, but the soldiers knew they couldn't let their guard down just yet. The Viet Minh, though diminished, were still a looming threat. As the soldiers began boarding the ships, a final wave of Viet Minh fighters launched an assault. Mortar shells exploded on the beach, and the sound of gunfire echoed across the shore. The French forces responded with overwhelming firepower, their machine guns and artillery silencing the attack. Captain Bigard stood on the deck of one of the ships, watching as the last of his men boarded. His face bore the lines of exhaustion, but his eyes remained sharp. The operation had been a success, but it had come at a great cost. The destroyed caches would deal a blow to the Viet Minh supply lines, but the memories of the fallen would linger long after the war. As the ships pulled away from the shore, the soldiers looked back at the jungle, its green expanse fading into the distance. Operation Hirondelle had tested their limits and taught them the brutal realities of war. For now, they were safe, but the war was far from over. As the French ships cut through the waters toward safety, the soldiers began to process the events of the past few days. The operation had been grueling, and the cost was evident. The men were physically and emotionally drained, their faces hollow from exhaustion and their uniforms soaked with sweat and grime. Some carried visible wounds, while others bore the unseen scars of combat. The ship's medics worked tirelessly to tend to those who had been injured during the operation. Corporal Michel Bernard, who had been grazed by a Viet Minh bullet, winced as a medic cleaned his wound. "You're lucky," the medic said with a faint smile. "Another inch, and you wouldn't be here." Bernard nodded, his gaze distant, lost in thoughts of the comrades who hadn't been so fortunate. Captain Marcel Bigard stood at the bow of the ship, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The operation had been successful in destroying vital Viet Minh supply caches, but the victory felt hollow. He knew the enemy would recover quickly and that the war's tide would soon shift again. "We bought ourselves some time," he muttered under his breath, "but not much." Nearby, Sergeant Pierre Leclerc sat with his squad, their camaraderie providing a small comfort. They shared stories, each man trying to lighten the somber mood. "Do you think they'll give us a medal for this?" one soldier joked, drawing a few chuckles. Leclerc smiled faintly, but his thoughts were on the young Corporal Marchand, whose absence was a painful reminder of the operation's cost. When the ships docked at a French-controlled port, the soldiers disembarked and were immediately taken to a secure location for debriefing. High-ranking officers, intelligence agents, and logisticians awaited their arrival, eager to assess the operation's outcome and gather valuable information. Captain Bigard led the briefing, his voice calm but authoritative. He detailed every phase of the operation, from the parachute drop near Lang's Sun to the discovery and destruction of the supply caches. Maps were spread across a table, marked with the locations of the caves and the paths taken by the troops. The Viet Minh were prepared for us, Bigard explained. Their ambushes were well coordinated, and their knowledge of the terrain gave them an advantage. We succeeded in our mission, but it was not without difficulty. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. Our men fought bravely, and we achieved our objectives. But the enemy is resilient, and we should expect retaliation. The intelligence officers examined the photographs and reports from the operation, noting the strategic importance of the destroyed caches. This will disrupt their supply lines for a while, one officer remarked, but we need to stay vigilant. They'll adapt, just as they always do. In the days following the operation, the soldiers were given a brief period of rest and recovery. Many of them struggled to shake off the memories of the jungle, the relentless heat, the suffocating humidity, and the ever-present threat of death. For some, the weight of what they had experienced was too much to bear. Private Claude Fournier, a young recruit who had been part of Leclerc's squad, spent hours staring at the sea, his expression unreadable. "It doesn't feel like we won," he confided to a fellow soldier. "We destroyed their supplies, sure, but at what cost? We lost friends out there." Others tried to find solace in routine. Corporal Bernard threw himself into physical training, pushing his body to the limit as a way to cope with the loss and guilt. Sergeant Leclerc took on the role of mentor, offering support and guidance to the younger soldiers. "We can't dwell on the past," he told them. "We have to keep moving forward." Captain Bigard, however, showed little sign of slowing down. He spent his days in meetings, planning the next steps in the campaign. Despite his calm demeanor, those who knew him well could see the toll the operation had taken. He carried the weight of his men's sacrifices, and it drove him to ensure that their efforts were not in vain. While the French soldiers recovered, the Viet Minh regrouped in the jungle. Though Operation Hirondelle had disrupted their supply chain, their spirit remained unbroken. Messages were sent to higher command, detailing the losses and calling for reinforcements. In a hidden base deep in the jungle, Commander Tran Ngoc Minh studied a map marked with the locations of the destroyed caches. His expression was grim, but his resolve was unwavering. "The French think they've won," he said to his officers, "but this is only a temporary setback. We'll rebuild, and we'll strike back harder than ever." The Viet Minh began to adapt their strategies, moving their supply lines deeper into the jungle and developing new methods to conceal their caches. They knew the French would continue to target their resources, but they were determined to make the cost of every operation unbearably high. The jungle itself seemed to bear witness to the conflict, its dense foliage hiding both the scars of battle and the preparations for the next confrontation. For both sides, the war was far from over, and the echoes of Operation Hirondelle would resonate in the battles to come. In the days following their return, Captain Marcel Bigard found himself reflecting on the choices he'd made during the operation. As a seasoned officer, he had led many missions, but Operation Hirondelle was different. The stakes had been higher, the enemy more cunning, and the losses more personal. Sitting alone in his quarters one evening, Bigard reviewed the photographs of the destroyed Viet Minh supply caches. The images told a story of success, but they couldn't erase the faces of the soldiers who hadn't made it back. He remembered Corporal Marchand's youthful enthusiasm and Private Fournier's quiet determination. Their absence weighed heavily on him. Despite his personal struggles, Bigard maintained a stoic demeanor around his men. He knew they looked to him for strength, and he wouldn't let them down. "We did what we had to do," he told his officers during a strategy meeting. "The mission was critical, and we succeeded. But we can't let our guard down. The Viet Minh are resourceful, and they'll strike again." His words resonated with the men, many of whom were still grappling with their own emotions. They respected Bigard not only for his tactical brilliance but for his ability to lead with a clear vision, even in the face of adversity. Back in the dense jungles near Lang Son, the Viet Minh wasted no time in analyzing their losses. Commander Tran Ngoc Minh, a meticulous and strategic thinker, convened a meeting with his officers to discuss the French raid. The destruction of the supply caches was a significant blow, but Minh was determined to turn the situation to their advantage. "We underestimated their resolve," Minh admitted, his voice calm but firm. "But we won't make the same mistake again. The jungle is our home, and we'll use it to its fullest." He ordered his men to begin relocating their remaining supplies to even more remote locations, using natural cave systems and underground tunnels to evade detection. Minh also implemented stricter protocols for guarding their supply lines. Scouts were posted at key points, and decoy caches were set up to mislead the French. Every move was calculated, designed to frustrate and exhaust the enemy. "If they want to come after us again," Minh said, "we'll make them pay for every step they take." The Viet Minh's adaptability was a testament to their resilience. They had learned from Operation Hirondelle, and their determination to outlast the French only grew stronger. For the soldiers who had participated in the operation, the physical toll was undeniable. Many suffered from heat exhaustion, dehydration, and lingering injuries. Medical reports revealed that the average soldier had lost over 11 pounds during the mission, a stark indicator of the grueling conditions they had endured. Sergeant Pierre Leclerc, who had pushed himself to the limit during the rearguard action, found himself confined to the medical tent for several days. The medics warned him to rest, but Leclerc's thoughts were with his men. "I'll be fine," he insisted, trying to mask his fatigue. "There's too much to do." The younger soldiers, like Corporal Bernard, found solace in the camaraderie of their comrades. They shared stories, laughed about the absurdities of jungle warfare, and supported one another through the recovery process. For many, these moments of connection were a lifeline, helping them cope with the trauma of the operation. The French High Command, recognizing the soldiers' sacrifices, commended their bravery and resilience. Medals were awarded, and promotions were granted, but for the men on the ground, the accolades felt hollow. They had survived, but they knew the war was far from over. Operation Hirondelle became a case study for the French military. High-ranking officers pored over the after-action reports, analyzing every detail to identify strengths and weaknesses. The operation had achieved its objectives, but the challenges faced by the soldiers highlighted the difficulties of jungle warfare. One of the key lessons was the importance of intelligence. The French had relied on aerial reconnaissance and local informants to identify the Viet Minh supply caches, but gaps in their knowledge had left them vulnerable to ambushes. Moving forward, they prioritized gathering more comprehensive intelligence to minimize risks. Another lesson was the need for better preparation. The extreme heat and rugged terrain had taken a severe toll on the soldiers, many of whom were unaccustomed to such conditions. The French military began implementing more rigorous training programs to ensure their troops were better equipped for the demands of the battlefield. Captain Bigard, who had been instrumental in the operation's success, shared his insights during a debriefing. "The jungle is unforgiving," he said. "It tests you in ways you can't prepare for. But if we adapt, if we learn from our mistakes, we can overcome even the toughest challenges." Despite their losses, the Viet Minh were far from defeated. In the weeks following Operation Hirondelle, they launched a series of small-scale attacks against French outposts in the region. These strikes, though limited in scope, were calculated to keep the French forces off balance and remind them of the Viet Minh's presence. One such attack occurred near Lac Binh, where a French patrol was ambushed while scouting the jungle. The Viet Minh, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain, outmaneuvered the patrol and inflicted heavy casualties before retreating into the shadows. For the French soldiers who had survived Operation Hirondelle, these attacks were a grim reminder of the enemy's resilience. They had struck a blow to the Viet Minh's logistics, but the jungle remained a battlefield of uncertainty and danger. Even weeks after Operation Hirondelle, the mission continued to cast a long shadow over those who had participated. For the French soldiers, the jungle had left its mark, not just in the form of wounds and weight loss but in the vivid memories of survival. Captain Marcel Bigard, though respected for his leadership, struggled with the ghosts of the operation. Each night, he replayed the ambushes, the split-second decisions, and the faces of the men who hadn't made it back. In the mess hall one evening, Bigard addressed his officers. "The operation was a success," he began, his voice steady. "But we must learn to measure success differently. It isn't just about destroying supply caches or returning with fewer losses than expected. It's about the lessons we carry forward, the respect we show for the men who fought beside us, and how we prepare for what's to come." His words resonated deeply. The men knew that what they had accomplished in Lang Son wasn't just another tactical maneuver. It was part of a larger, grueling war that demanded resilience, adaptability, and unity. At French military headquarters in Hanoi, the intelligence division meticulously analyzed the outcomes of Operation Hirondelle. Black and white photographs of the destroyed Viet Minh supply caches were laid out across long tables, along with detailed maps of Lang Son and Lac Binh. The officers noted the logistical precision of the French forces but also the ruthless efficiency of the Viet Minh in their counterattacks. Colonel Bernard Dupuy, overseeing the analysis, called for Captain Bigard to share his first-hand perspective. "Captain," Dupuy began, "your mission dealt a significant blow to the enemy, but it's clear they've adapted quickly. What are your recommendations for future operations?" Bigard spoke candidly. "We underestimated their ability to anticipate us," he admitted. "The Viet Minh are experts in guerrilla tactics, and their knowledge of the terrain gives them the upper hand. Future missions will require greater coordination, deeper intelligence, and stronger logistical support. Above all, we must be prepared for prolonged engagements." The colonel nodded, making notes as Bigard continued. The insights gained from Hirondelle would shape the French military's approach to jungle warfare, but everyone in the room knew that victory in this war was far from assured. Though Operation Hirondelle was officially deemed a success, the cost of the withdrawal lingered in the minds of many. The long march to Lac Binh had taken a heavy toll on the soldiers. Every step had been a test of endurance, and the ambushes along the way had pushed them to their limits. Private Claude Fournier, a quiet soldier who had endured the operation without complaint, was one of many who struggled to process what he'd experienced. Sitting by a campfire one evening, he confided in his friend, Corporal Michel Bernard. "Do you think it was worth it?" Fournier asked, staring into the flames. Bernard, still recovering from his own injuries, hesitated before replying. "I don't know," he admitted. "We destroyed their supplies, but the jungle, it felt like it would swallow us whole. Maybe it's not about knowing if it's worth it. Maybe it's about surviving long enough to find out. Their conversation was one of many similar exchanges happening across the French encampments. For the soldiers, the war had become deeply personal, a constant struggle between duty, survival, and the haunting question of whether their sacrifices truly mattered. Back at their base, the French High Command recognized the need to repair the morale of the soldiers who had participated in Operation Hirondelle. Letters from home were distributed, care packages arrived, and the men were granted brief periods of leave to rest and recover. Captain Bigger, understanding the importance of unity, organized a small ceremony to honor the fallen. The names of those who had lost their lives during the operation were read aloud, their sacrifices acknowledged with solemn respect. These men gave everything, Bigard said during the ceremony. Their bravery will not be forgotten. The ceremony had a profound effect on the men. For many, it was a moment of closure, a chance to honor their comrades and reaffirm their commitment to the mission. While the war continued to rage, the bonds forged during Operation Hirondelle remained unbreakable. Though the operation had ended, the jungle near Lang's Son remained a silent witness to the events that had unfolded. The scars of battle were still visible, charred remains of supply caches, the remnants of makeshift encampments, and a faint smell of gunpowder lingering in the air. The Viet Minh, though weakened by the loss of their supplies, moved deeper into the jungle to regroup. Commander Tran Ngoc Minh stood at the entrance of a new supply depot, hidden even more carefully than the last. The French will come again, he told his men. And when they do, we'll be ready. For the French, the silence of the jungle was both a victory and a warning. They had struck a blow, but they knew the Viet Minh were far from defeated. Operation Hirondelle had been just one chapter in a long, brutal war, a conflict that would continue to test both sides in ways they had yet to imagine. The story of Operation POLLUX. The year is 1953, and the jungles of northern Vietnam hum with tension. The First Indochina War rages on, a brutal conflict between the French Union forces and the Viet Minh. Nestled within these war-torn lands lies Lai Chau, a remote province home to diverse ethnic groups. Amid the dense fog of war, Operation POLLUX unfolds, a desperate maneuver to evacuate French and Allied forces to the fortress of Dien Bien Phu. As the operation begins, it becomes a stage for bravery, betrayal, and strategy, forever altering the course of the war. November 1953 brought the cold winds of change to the Thai region in northern Vietnam. French Union forces, under the command of General René Cogny, faced a dire challenge. The Viet Minh, emboldened by their successes, had swept through the Black River region, forcing the French into a corner. Lai Chau, once a beacon of French influence and Thai Federation loyalty, was now vulnerable to the advancing communist forces. It was here, amidst the rugged mountains and dense jungles, that Operation POLLUX would take shape. The plan was audacious yet desperate. Thousands of French soldiers, Thai allies, and their families would embark on a perilous retreat from Lai Chau to Dien Bien Phu. The path was fraught with danger, treacherous terrain, monsoon rains, and an enemy that lurked in every shadow. Yet, for the French High Command, it was the only way to consolidate their forces and hold on to the vital Dien Bien Phu base. Among the evacuees was Deo Van Long, the white Thai president of the Sip Song Chau Thai Federation. A staunch ally of the French, he had much to lose, his authority, his people, and perhaps his life. Long had vowed to protect his people, but the Viet Minh's relentless march had left him little choice but to join the retreat. His white Thai warriors, fierce and loyal, would play a critical role in safeguarding the convoy. As the operation commenced, the Viet Minh forces, led by Le Quang Ba, watched closely. They had no intention of letting the French escape unscathed. Elements of the 316th Division, seasoned and determined, prepared to intercept and dismantle the convoy. For them, this was not just a battle, it was a chance to deliver a devastating blow to French morale. The convoy began its journey at dawn on November 7, 1953. Soldiers and civilians moved in tight formations, their footsteps blending with the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. The air was thick with tension, each creak of a tree branch or flutter of wings sending waves of unease through the group. The French knew they were being watched, but they could only guess from where. Captain Henri Dubois, a veteran of numerous campaigns, rode at the head of the column. His sharp eyes scanned the jungle, searching for signs of ambush. He had fought the Viet Minh before and knew their tactics: strike fast, strike hard, and disappear into the wilderness. His men were wary, their fingers hovering over triggers, ready to respond to the slightest movement. Behind them, Deo Van Long's warriors moved silently. Clad in traditional attire, they carried rifles and blades, their steps as light as the mist that clung to the forest floor. They had a deep knowledge of the terrain, guiding the convoy through narrow passes and across raging rivers. Yet even they knew the dangers that lay ahead. The Viet Minh were masters of guerrilla warfare, and the jungle was their ally. As the day wore on, the convoy reached a narrow gorge, flanked by towering cliffs. The air was eerily still, and a sense of foreboding gripped the soldiers. Captain Dubois signaled for the column to halt, his instinct screaming of an impending attack. Moments later, the silence shattered, a thunderous explosion rocked the gorge as the Viet Minh sprung their ambush. Chaos erupted as the Viet Minh descended from the cliffs, their battle cries echoing through the gorge. They rained bullets and grenades upon the convoy, targeting the front and rear to trap the French forces in a deadly crossfire. Smoke and dust filled the air, obscuring the battlefield and adding to the confusion. Captain Dubois barked orders, rallying his men to form a defensive perimeter. Soldiers scrambled for cover, returning fire with everything they had. The roar of gunfire and the screams of the wounded created a cacophony of terror. Yet, amidst the chaos, the white Thai warriors held their ground, their sharp eyes picking out Viet Minh fighters among the foliage. Deo Van Long himself fought with a determination born of desperation. Armed with a carbine, he moved through the ranks, encouraging his men and helping the wounded. For Long, this was not just a battle for survival, it was a battle for the future of his people. If they failed here, there would be no escape from the wrath of the Viet Minh. After what felt like an eternity, the French forces managed to push the Viet Minh back. The cliffs fell silent once more, save for the groans of the wounded and the distant rustle of leaves. The convoy had survived the ambush, but at a terrible cost. Dozens of soldiers and civilians lay dead or dying, their blood staining the rocky ground. The survivors regrouped at the gorge's exit, their spirits battered but unbroken. Medics worked tirelessly to tend to the wounded, while scouts ventured ahead to ensure the path was clear. Captain Dubois knew they could not linger, the Viet Minh would strike again, and next time, they might not be so fortunate. Deo Van Long convened with Dubois, his face grim but resolute. The Thai leader expressed his gratitude for the French soldiers' bravery but reminded Dubois of the civilians' vulnerability. The convoy had to move faster, despite their losses. Dubois nodded, his respect for Long growing with each exchange. As night fell, the convoy pressed on, guided by the faint light of the moon. The jungle seemed to close in around them, its shadows deepening into an almost suffocating presence. Every rustle of leaves, every distant cry of an animal, set nerves on edge. For the evacuees, sleep was a distant dream. Unbeknownst to them, Lo Quang Ba's forces were already preparing their next move. The Viet Minh commander had not anticipated the convoy's resilience, but he was determined to make them pay for every step. His men, seasoned and resourceful, set traps and laid plans for another ambush. The war was far from over. The convoy trudged forward as the dense jungle seemed to tighten its grip, turning the path into a labyrinth of shadows and uncertainty. The narrow trails, slick with mud from recent rains, were treacherous. Wagons carrying supplies and the wounded frequently became stuck, forcing soldiers to pause and push through the mire. Every delay heightened the risk of another Viet Minh attack. Captain Henri Dubois had little rest. His mind worked tirelessly to calculate their next moves, every decision potentially life or death. The Thai warriors proved invaluable, scouting ahead and reporting back with news of the terrain and possible enemy positions. Deo Van Long's leadership inspired them to press on despite their fears. To him, this retreat wasn't a defeat but a chance to regroup and protect his people. As the convoy approached a rickety wooden bridge spanning a raging river, tension reached its peak. The structure groaned under the weight of the first vehicles, and Dubois suspected sabotage. He ordered his engineers to inspect the bridge, but there was no time for extensive repairs. The convoy had to cross quickly, knowing the enemy was never far behind. Lo Quang Ba watched from a hidden vantage point, his expression unreadable. He had deliberately allowed the convoy to advance unmolested, knowing the terrain would exhaust and demoralize the French. His men had laid traps along the convoy's route, and the weakened state of the bridge was part of his strategy. He gave a quiet order, and his soldiers disappeared into the jungle, waiting to strike. The first wave of soldiers and vehicles began to cross the bridge, its planks creaking ominously under the strain. Scouts stationed on the far bank kept their weapons ready, scanning the trees for signs of movement. Deo Van Long's warriors were among the last to cross, ensuring no stragglers were left behind. The air was thick with unease. As the final group prepared to cross, a sudden explosion shattered the tense quiet. A portion of the bridge collapsed, plunging soldiers and supplies into the churning river below. Screams of panic and orders to regroup filled the air as the Viet Minh launched their assault. They emerged from the jungle, firing from concealed positions on both sides of the river. Captain Dubois ordered his men to form defensive lines on the far bank, while those still stranded on the near side fought desperately to hold their ground. The river, now a barrier between the two groups, became a scene of chaos. The wounded were carried across on makeshift rafts, while the Thai warriors provided cover, their sharp shooting picking off enemy soldiers one by one. Deo Van Long joined the fight, his rifle steady despite the pandemonium. His warriors, though outnumbered, fought fiercely, buying precious time for the civilians to escape. Dubois, seeing the dire situation, made the difficult decision to abandon some of the heavier equipment to hasten the crossing. By the time the last of the convoy made it across, the bridge was in flames, and the Viet Minh had disappeared once again into the jungle. The convoy regrouped in a small clearing, the survivors huddled together in exhaustion. Medics worked tirelessly to treat the wounded, their supplies dwindling with each passing hour. The loss of the bridge weighed heavily on Dubois and Long, though they had escaped, it came at a steep cost. Nearly 200 soldiers and civilians were either killed or captured during the assault. Among the survivors, whispers of despair began to spread. Many questioned whether they would ever reach Dien Bien Phu alive. Captain Dubois addressed his men that night, his voice steady despite his own doubts. "We are not defeated," he told them. Every step we take is a victory. For the fallen, for those who depend on us, we will not falter. Deo Van Long echoed these sentiments to his people, urging them to hold on to hope. He reminded them of their shared resilience and the importance of reaching the safety of Dien Bien Phu. His words, combined with his visible bravery during the battle, reignited a flicker of determination among the convoy. Meanwhile, Lo Quang Ba's forces regrouped and assessed their losses. The Viet Minh commander knew he had inflicted significant damage, but the convoy's resilience had surprised him. He devised a new strategy, focusing on psychological warfare to wear down the French and their allies further. The jungle would be his ally, and fear his weapon. As the convoy pressed on, the Viet Minh escalated their tactics. They left trails of broken equipment and the occasional body of a French soldier as cruel reminders of their presence. At night, haunting calls echoed through the trees, designed to unsettle the exhausted evacuees. Traps became more frequent, hidden pits lined with sharpened stakes and explosive devices buried beneath the mud. The psychological toll on the convoy was immense. Soldiers began to flinch at every sound, their nerves frayed from sleepless nights. Civilians clung to each other, their eyes darting at every shadow. Even the Thai warriors, seasoned in jungle warfare, felt the weight of the constant tension. Captain Du Bois and Deo Van Long worked tirelessly to maintain morale, but the strain was evident. In a moment of respite, Du Bois confided in Long, "They're trying to break us," he admitted. "But we can't let them win. If we lose hope, we lose everything." Long nodded, his expression resolute. "Then we must keep moving. The jungle is their home, but it will not be our grave." The convoy continued its march, each step an act of defiance. The path to Dien Bien Phu remained fraught with danger, but their determination grew stronger with every challenge. They knew the Viet Minh would strike again, but they were ready to face whatever lay ahead. The convoy reached a dense section of jungle, where towering trees formed a natural canopy, blotting out the sun. The terrain was unforgiving, with steep inclines and narrow passages that slowed their progress to a crawl. Deo Van Long's warriors took the lead, their knowledge of the land invaluable in navigating the treacherous terrain. Every step forward was a battle against nature itself. The Thai warriors became the convoy's silent guardians, scouting ahead and setting traps of their own to deter the Viet Minh. Using bamboo spikes and rudimentary alarms, they created a protective shield around the group. Despite their best efforts, the haunting cries of the Viet Minh still echoed through the trees, a reminder that danger was never far away. Captain Du Bois marveled at the Thais' resilience and ingenuity. They moved with an almost otherworldly grace, their familiarity with the jungle giving the convoy a fighting chance. Du Bois made a point to thank Deo Van Long personally, knowing that without the Thai, their journey would have been impossible. The bond between the French soldiers and the Thai warriors grew stronger with every passing day. But even with their vigilance, the convoy was not immune to the jungle's perils. Several men fell victim to the Viet Minh's traps, their cries of pain sending ripples of fear through the ranks. The convoy pressed on, each loss a heavy weight on their collective shoulders. They knew the Viet Minh were watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As night fell, the convoy set up camp in a small clearing. Fires were lit to ward off the biting cold, and guards were posted around the perimeter. The soldiers and civilians huddled together, their exhaustion evident. For a brief moment, there was a semblance of peace as they shared meager rations and exchanged quiet words of encouragement. But the Viet Minh had no intention of allowing the convoy to rest. Under the cover of darkness, they crept closer, their movements masked by the jungle's natural sounds. Le Quang Ba had planned a coordinated attack, aiming to catch the French off guard and sow chaos within their ranks. The attack began with a series of mortar shells, which exploded with deafening roars, sending shards of metal and earth flying in all directions. The once quiet camp erupted into chaos as soldiers scrambled to return fire. The Viet Minh emerged from the shadows, their rifles blazing as they closed in on the camp. Captain Du Bois quickly took command, rallying his men and organizing a defensive line. Deo Van Long and his warriors fought with ferocity, their intimate knowledge of the terrain giving them an edge in the chaotic skirmish. The civilians, caught in the crossfire, huddled together, praying for the nightmare to end. The battle raged through the night, the jungle illuminated by the flickering flames of burning tents and vehicles. When dawn finally broke, the Viet Minh retreated, melting back into the jungle as quickly as they had appeared. The convoy had survived, but their losses were staggering. Bodies lay strewn across the clearing, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and blood. The aftermath of the attack was a grim reminder of the harsh realities of war. Medics moved from one wounded soldier to the next, their hands trembling from exhaustion. Survivors gathered the dead and buried them in shallow graves, marking each with a simple wooden cross. There was no time for proper ceremonies, only a solemn moment of silence before the march resumed. Captain Du Bois and Deo Van Long surveyed the devastation together. They had fought side by side, their combined efforts preventing what could have been a complete massacre. A newfound respect blossomed between the two leaders, their shared hardships forging a bond that transcended cultural and linguistic barriers. Among the survivors, whispers of gratitude for the Thai warriors began to spread. Their courage and skill had saved countless lives, and even the most skeptical French soldiers now saw them as indispensable allies. The civilians, too, found solace in the warriors' quiet strength, drawing hope from their determination to protect the convoy. As the convoy moved forward, a subtle shift in morale became evident. Despite their losses, they began to believe in their ability to reach Dien Bien Phu. Each survivor carried the memory of those they had lost, their sacrifices fueling the collective will to endure. But they knew the Viet Minh would not give up so easily. The convoy's path led them into the highlands, where the air grew thinner and the jungle gave way to rocky terrain. The climb was arduous, testing the limits of their endurance. Supplies were running dangerously low, and the wounded struggled to keep up. Captain Du Bois ordered the strongest soldiers to carry the weakest, ensuring that no one was left behind. The highlands presented new challenges. The narrow trails left the convoy vulnerable to ambush, and the rocky outcrops provided ample cover for the Viet Minh. Scouts reported signs of enemy activity, but no attacks came. The silence was unnerving, and Du Bois suspected it was a deliberate tactic to lull them into a false sense of security. Deo Van Long's warriors took the lead once more, their sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. They moved with caution, aware that the highlands were as perilous as the jungle. Despite their vigilance, the convoy's pace slowed, and exhaustion began to take its toll. Le Quang Ba watched from a distance, his forces lying in wait. He had chosen this location for its strategic advantage, knowing the convoy would struggle to navigate the rugged terrain. His men were ready to strike, but he was patient. He wanted to break the French completely, and the highlands offered the perfect opportunity to do so. The convoy trudged onward, every step an act of sheer will. The highlands seemed endless, the rocky trails cutting into their boots and morale. Each soldier and civilian bore the weight of exhaustion, the air thin and unkind. Yet, they pressed on, driven by the faint hope of reaching Dien Bien Phu before their strength gave out. The Viet Minh's absence was unnerving. For days, there had been no attacks, only fleeting shadows in the distance and the eerie feeling of being watched. Captain Du Bois suspected a trap but had no choice but to keep moving. Every scout report hinted at enemy movements just out of sight, confirming the Viet Minh were biding their time. Dale Van Long's warriors noticed subtle signs of the Viet Minh's presence, fresh footprints in the mud, broken branches along the trail, and the faint scent of smoke on the wind. They warned Du Bois that the enemy was near, but their exact location remained a mystery. The convoy moved in tight formation, weapons at the ready, every creak of the terrain amplifying their unease. One night, the Viet Minh made their presence known. Fires flickered in the distance, their glow visible from the convoy's makeshift camp. The sight sent ripples of fear through the group, a stark reminder that the enemy was never far. The fires were a message, a psychological tactic to remind the French of their precarious position. For the convoy, sleep became an unattainable luxury. As dawn broke, the convoy faced a narrow pass carved into the highlands. Sheer cliffs loomed on either side, their jagged edges forming a natural choke point. Du Bois hesitated, knowing the terrain was perfect for an ambush. Yet, there was no alternative, the pass was the only way forward. Dale Van Long's warriors scouted ahead, their movements cautious and deliberate. They reported no immediate signs of the Viet Minh, but the air was heavy with the promise of violence. Du Bois ordered his men to proceed in staggered groups, each covering the other as they advanced. Civilians were kept in the center, shielded by soldiers on all sides. The first group made it through without incident, their relieved faces visible as they reached the far side. The second group began to cross when the attack came. The Viet Minh, concealed among the cliffs, unleashed a hail of gunfire and grenades. The sound of the ambush echoed through the pass, mingling with the cries of the wounded. Du Bois acted swiftly, ordering his men to return fire and take cover. Dale Van Long rallied his warriors, who climbed the cliffs to engage the Viet Minh at close range. The battle was fierce, the narrow pass amplifying the chaos. Soldiers and civilians alike fought for their lives, their survival hinging on their ability to hold their ground. The choke point became a deadly battlefield as the convoy fought to repel the Viet Minh. Smoke and dust filled the air, obscuring the jagged cliffs and turning the pass into a suffocating maze. Despite the chaos, Captain Du Bois remained a steady presence, shouting orders and directing his men with unwavering resolve. Dale Van Long's warriors displayed incredible bravery, scaling the cliffs under heavy fire to confront the Viet Minh. Their intimate knowledge of the terrain gave them an edge, and their determination inspired the French soldiers to hold their positions. The Thai fighters moved like shadows, their every strike calculated and precise. Civilians huddled together in the center of the convoy, their fear palpable. Some took up arms, determined to protect their families, while others prayed silently for deliverance. The wounded were carried to the rear, where medics worked tirelessly to save as many as they could. After hours of intense fighting, the Viet Minh began to retreat. Their losses had been heavy, and the convoy's resilience had once again thwarted their plans. The survivors breathed a collective sigh of relief, though the cost of their victory was evident. Dozens lay dead or wounded, their blood staining the rocky ground. The convoy regrouped on the far side of the pass, their spirits battered but not broken. The medics tended to the wounded, their supplies running dangerously low. Makeshift stretchers were fashioned from branches, and the dead were buried in shallow graves. Each loss weighed heavily on the survivors, their faces etched with grief. Captain Du Bois and Dale Van Long met to assess their situation. They had survived another ambush, but their strength was waning. Supplies were critically low, and the wounded slowed their progress. Long suggested sending a small group ahead to Dien Bien Phu to request reinforcements and supplies. Du Bois agreed, knowing it was their best chance of survival. A team of Thai warriors volunteered for the mission, their loyalty to Long unwavering. They carried messages detailing the convoy's plight, their lives entrusted to the perilous journey ahead. As they disappeared into the highlands, the convoy resumed its march, their steps heavy with uncertainty. The Viet Minh, though beaten back, were far from defeated. Lo Quang Ba's forces regrouped and plotted their next move, determined to deliver a decisive blow. For the convoy, the road to Dien Bien Phu remained long and perilous, each step fraught with danger. The operation was far from over. As the convoy emerged from the choke point, the terrain began to shift again. The jagged cliffs gave way to rolling hills, their steep inclines offering a clear view of the surrounding landscape. Captain Du Bois used this opportunity to reorganize the remaining forces. Scouts were dispatched to search for water sources, as the convoy's supplies were nearing depletion. Hunger and thirst gnawed at the survivors, adding to their growing despair. Dale Van Long convened with his warriors, instructing them to prioritize protecting the civilians and ensuring their safe passage. He understood the fragility of their morale. One more major loss could shatter their resolve entirely. Long's calm demeanor and firm leadership provided a lifeline for many, though even he felt the strain of their predicament. Meanwhile, the Viet Minh had not been idle. Lo Quang Ba, recognizing the convoy's dwindling resources, ordered his forces to intensify their efforts to isolate and weaken the French. Small raiding parties began to target the rear of the convoy, striking swiftly before retreating into the hills. These tactics kept the convoy on edge, forcing them to stay constantly alert. Du Bois, aware of the toll this psychological warfare was taking, devised a desperate plan. He ordered a counter-raid on a suspected Viet Minh supply cache located nearby. A hand-picked group of French soldiers and Thai warriors volunteered for the mission, knowing the risks but understanding the potential rewards. Success could mean the difference between life and death for the convoy. Under the cover of darkness, the raiding party set out toward the suspected Viet Minh supply point. The night was moonless, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and foliage. Every step was calculated, the soldiers moving in silence to avoid detection. Dale Van Long's warriors led the way, their intimate knowledge of the terrain guiding the group through hidden paths. As they approached the cache, the faint glow of lanterns revealed a small Viet Minh encampment nestled in a hollow. Lo Quang Ba's forces, confident in their dominance, had left the site lightly guarded. Du Bois saw this as their chance to strike. He signaled for the attack, and the raiding party descended on the camp with precision. The skirmish was brief but intense. The French and Thai forces overwhelmed the surprised guards, seizing weapons, ammunition, and much-needed food supplies. The victory was a small but significant morale boost for the raiding party. However, Du Bois knew the operation would not go unnoticed. The Viet Minh would undoubtedly retaliate, and time was of the essence. The raiding party returned to the convoy before dawn, their success greeted with relief and gratitude. The supplies were distributed among the survivors, providing a brief reprieve from hunger and exhaustion. Spirits lifted, if only temporarily, as the convoy prepared to continue its journey. As the convoy pressed on, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, signaling an approaching storm. The air grew heavy, and the distant rumble of thunder set nerves on edge. Du Bois ordered the convoy to pick up the pace, hoping to find shelter before the storm broke. The wounded were carried with greater urgency, their pain compounded by the rough terrain. Deo Van Long's warriors scouted ahead, searching for a suitable location to camp. They found a small plateau overlooking a valley, its rocky outcrops providing natural cover. The convoy settled in as the first drops of rain began to fall, the storm quickly escalating into a torrential downpour. The rain brought its own challenges. The trails turned to mud, making movement nearly impossible. Fires sputtered and died, leaving the survivors shivering in the cold. Yet the storm also brought a strange sense of security. The Viet Minh, like the convoy, were forced to seek shelter, providing a temporary respite from their attacks. For Du Bois and Long, the storm offered a chance to regroup. They used the time to strengthen their defenses, setting traps and fortifying their position. The civilians found solace in the break from the relentless march, though the fear of what lay ahead lingered. They all knew the storm was only a brief pause in the ongoing battle. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the landscape drenched and glistening in the pale light of dawn. The convoy resumed its journey, the wet earth clinging to their boots and wagons. Though the rain had washed away some of their tracks, Du Bois knew the Viet Minh would not be far behind. Lo Quang Ba, undeterred by the convoy's progress, ordered his forces to prepare for a decisive attack. The Viet Minh commander understood the convoy's route and planned to ambush them at a river crossing further ahead. His goal was to destroy the French forces and capture Deo Van Long, whose leadership was vital to the Thai resistance. Du Bois, sensing the impending danger, doubled the number of scouts and ordered strict discipline among the ranks. Civilians were instructed to stay within the protective perimeter, and soldiers maintained a constant state of readiness. Every step was taken with caution, the convoy bracing for the inevitable clash. As the convoy neared the river, the tension was palpable. The soldiers and civilians moved in near silence, their senses heightened by the oppressive stillness of the jungle. They had survived ambushes, starvation, and storms, but the road to Dien Bien Phu was far from over. The final stretch would test their strength, courage, and unity like never before. The convoy reached the river as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. The wide expanse of water shimmered with deceptive tranquility, the current swift and unforgiving. Captain Du Bois and Deo Van Long stood on the riverbank, assessing the situation. The crossing was inevitable, yet fraught with danger. Both men knew the Viet Minh would likely be waiting for them on the other side. Du Bois ordered his engineers to begin constructing makeshift rafts using supplies and salvaged materials. The civilians, weary but cooperative, assisted in the effort. The plan was simple yet risky: send a small group of soldiers across first to secure the far bank, then ferry the civilians and the rest of the convoy. The first group, led by a seasoned lieutenant, set out with grim determination. Their rafts wobbled against the strong current, but the soldiers pressed on, rifles held at the ready. Tension gripped the convoy as they watched the rafts inch toward the far shore, every second stretching into an eternity. When the group reached the far bank without incident, a wave of cautious relief spread through the convoy. Du Bois gave the order to begin the full crossing. Soldiers formed a protective perimeter around the civilians, their eyes scanning the tree-line for signs of movement. The river carried their hopes and fears alike, the crossing a fragile lifeline to safety. Just as the last rafts were leaving the riverbank, the Viet Minh attacked. Hidden snipers opened fire from the jungle, their shots cutting through the air and striking fear into the convoy. The river became a chaotic scene as soldiers scrambled to return fire and protect the civilians. On the far bank, the advance group established a defensive position, firing back at the Viet Minh with everything they had. Captain Du Bois took command of the rear guard, rallying his men to hold the enemy at bay. The Thai warriors, led by Deo Van Long, moved swiftly to flank the attackers, their knowledge of the terrain turning the tide of the battle. The river crossing devolved into a desperate fight for survival. Soldiers waded into the water to retrieve civilians who had been thrown overboard, their movements hindered by the strong current. The Viet Minh intensified their assault, determined to inflict maximum damage before retreating. After a grueling hour of combat, the convoy managed to repel the attackers. The Viet Minh withdrew into the jungle, leaving behind a trail of destruction. The survivors were left to regroup on the far bank, their numbers diminished but their resolve unbroken. The river had become yet another battleground, its waters carrying the echoes of their struggle. The aftermath of the river crossing was somber. The convoy had suffered heavy losses, many lay wounded, and several civilians and soldiers had been swept away by the current or killed in the attack. Medics worked tirelessly to treat the injured, their supplies stretched to the limit. Captain Du Bois and Deo Van Long surveyed the scene, their faces grim but resolute. Despite the losses, the crossing marked a significant milestone. They had survived yet another Viet Minh assault and were one step closer to Dien Bien Phu. The soldiers and civilians found solace in small victories. Every successful defense, every life saved was a testament to their resilience. Du Bois gathered his men that evening, addressing them with quiet determination. "We've endured storms, ambushes, and battles," he said. "Each step forward is a triumph. We will not let our fallen comrades' sacrifices be in vain." His words rekindled a spark of hope among the weary survivors, reminding them of their shared purpose. Deo Van Long echoed these sentiments among the Thai warriors, thanking them for their bravery and urging them to continue the fight. For Long, the journey was more than a retreat, it was a testament to the unyielding spirit of his people. Together, they prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The convoy pressed on through the highlands, their destination drawing tantalizingly closer. The terrain began to level out, offering a reprieve from the grueling climbs and descents. The change in landscape brought a renewed sense of purpose, though the threat of the Viet Minh still loomed large. Scouts reported signs of enemy activity ahead, disturbed trails, abandoned campsites, and freshly dug trenches. Du Bois knew the Viet Minh were preparing for one final ambush, a desperate attempt to annihilate the convoy before they could reach Dien Bien Phu. He ordered his men to remain vigilant, reinforcing their defenses and ensuring the civilians stayed within the protective perimeter. The nights were the most dangerous. The Viet Minh used the cover of darkness to harass the convoy, firing sporadic shots and setting traps along the trail. The psychological toll was immense, but the survivors pressed on, their determination unwavering. Every step forward was a defiance of the odds. As they approached the outskirts of Dien Bien Phu, the distant sound of artillery fire echoed through the air. The French stronghold was within reach, its defenses a beacon of hope for the battered convoy. But the Viet Minh would not let them escape so easily. The final battle was imminent. The story of Operation CEINTURE. Operation CEINTURE unfolded in the waning days of 1947 as a month-long military endeavor intended to sever Viet Minh influence from a strategic region encompassing Hanoi, Thanh Nguyen, and Tuan Quang. The stakes were monumental. For the French, success would reinforce their grip over Indochina. For the Viet Minh, survival meant preserving their dream of an independent Vietnam. Soldiers on both sides prepared for a clash that would test their resolve, ingenuity, and endurance. The jungle, with its impenetrable canopy and hidden dangers, became both a refuge and a battlefield, its silence often shattered by the echo of gunfire. This is the story of a war that was as much about strategy as it was about the individuals who lived through it, officers and guerrillas, villagers and refugees, each swept into the maelstrom of history. As the French paratroopers descended and the Viet Minh forces maneuvered, lives intersected in unexpected ways, creating a tapestry of human struggle and resilience. The sky over Dong Bac was a blanket of muted gray, the sun hidden behind a veil of thick clouds. Below, the French forces assembled with precision, their uniforms damp with the humidity of the approaching monsoon. Jean-Étienne Valois, the French commander, stood at the edge of a hastily constructed airstrip, watching as paratroop battalions prepared for deployment. 18 battalions were at his command, a formidable force tasked with a daunting mission, to drive the Viet Minh from the region and restore French control. Farther north, the Viet Minh's 112 Regiment huddled in hidden encampments, their spirits bolstered by the knowledge of the terrain. Among them was Nguyen Van Thursday, a young soldier barely out of his teens. The jungle was his home, its winding paths and dense foliage offering both protection and peril. He had heard whispers of the French operation but remained resolute. "We fight for freedom," his commander had said. "The jungle is our ally." The operation commenced at dawn on November 20, 1947. French paratroopers leapt from their aircraft, their chutes blossoming like white flowers against the gray sky. The jungle below seemed endless, its treetops swaying in the breeze. Naval landing craft churned through the rivers, their decks lined with soldiers scanning the banks for signs of movement. The French aimed to encircle the region, creating a belt to trap the Viet Minh. But the Viet Minh were elusive. As the French advanced, they found empty villages and abandoned weapon caches. Trails that seemed promising led to dead ends or ambushes. Nguyen and his comrades moved silently through the jungle, their footsteps muffled by the wet undergrowth. They had no intention of confronting the French head-on. Instead, they would strike where the enemy least expected, then vanish into the shadows. The first wave of paratroopers touched down in the northern outskirts of Hanoi, their boots crunching against the damp earth. Lieutenant Pierre Marchand, a seasoned officer with lines of worry etched on his face, led his platoon cautiously into the underbrush. The mission was clear: secure key routes and eliminate any signs of Viet Minh presence, but Pierre knew the jungle could swallow armies whole. As the French soldiers moved deeper into the wilderness, the oppressive heat pressed down on them. The air was thick with the scent of wet foliage and the hum of unseen insects. Pierre gestured for his men to halt as they approached a clearing. "Watch the tree lines," he whispered. The Viet Minh had mastered the art of camouflage, and every shadow seemed to hide an ambush. Meanwhile, in a concealed camp several kilometers away, Nguyen Van Thursday and his unit received reports of the French landing. Their commander, a wiry man named Tran Hong, studied a rough map spread out on the ground. "They are bold, but they underestimate us," Tran said, his voice steady. "We will let them advance, then strike where they are weakest." The first skirmish came at dusk. A French patrol stumbled upon a small group of Viet Minh fighters hiding near a riverbank. Gunfire erupted, echoing through the jungle. Pierre's unit rushed to reinforce the patrol, their rifles at the ready. By the time they arrived, the Viet Minh had melted into the shadows, leaving behind only spent shells and a single injured fighter. The jungle seemed to mock the French with its silence. As Operation CEINTURE pressed on, the jungle itself became a formidable adversary. Thick vegetation slowed the French troops, their movements constrained by the labyrinth of trees and vines. The Viet Minh exploited every advantage, setting traps and ambushing isolated units. Morale among the French soldiers began to waver as they faced an enemy that seemed to vanish like mist. Nguyen Van Thursday felt a surge of pride as his unit executed a textbook ambush along a narrow trail. Hidden in the underbrush, they waited until the French column was fully exposed before opening fire. The chaos was brief but devastating. As the French regrouped, Nguyen's unit disappeared into the jungle, their path concealed by the dense foliage. Back at the French command post, General Valui reviewed the latest reports with a frown. Casualties were mounting, and the Viet Minh's guerrilla tactics were taking their toll. "We must tighten the cordon," he said to his officers. "If they slip through, this entire operation will be for nothing." As night fell, the jungle came alive with the sounds of insects and distant gunfire. Pierre Marchand sat with his men around a small fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. "We are not just fighting men," he said softly. "We are fighting the land itself." His words hung in the air, a somber reminder of the challenges ahead. The local villagers found themselves caught in the crossfire, their lives upended by the conflict. In a small hamlet near Tuen Quang, Mylene watched anxiously as French soldiers marched through the village, their boots stirring up clouds of dust. Her husband, a fisherman, had been conscripted by the Viet Minh weeks earlier, leaving her to care for their 2 young children. The French offered promises of protection, but fear lingered in the villagers' hearts. They had seen too much to trust easily. Some provided the French with information, hoping to avoid retribution. Others secretly aided the Viet Minh, risking everything for the chance of freedom. Mylene chose to remain silent, her loyalty torn between survival and resistance. One evening, a group of Viet Minh fighters arrived at the village under cover of darkness. Nguyen Van Thursday was among them, his eyes scanning the faces of the villagers. "We need food and supplies," their leader said. Mylene hesitated before stepping forward, offering a sack of rice. She could feel the weight of her choice pressing on her as the fighters vanished into the night. By dawn, the French had discovered the Viet Minh's visit. Suspicion fell on the villagers, and interrogations began. Mylene clutched her children tightly, praying that her silence would protect her family. The war had turned neighbor against neighbor, and trust was a fragile thread easily severed. As Operation CEINTURE entered its second week, the French troops began to grasp the difficulty of their mission. The Viet Minh were not a conventional army, they were shadows, slipping through the French cordon with uncanny ease. The French commanders debated strategies late into the night, their maps spread across tables under dim lantern light. For every plan they devised, the jungle seemed to conspire against them. Lieutenant Pierre Marchand's platoon was tasked with patrolling a key river crossing. The humid air was thick with tension as they moved cautiously along the banks. Every rustling leaf and snapping twig set their nerves on edge. When they reached the crossing, they found it abandoned, the Viet Minh's tracks already obscured by the shifting currents. Frustration simmered among the soldiers, who felt they were always one step behind their elusive enemy. Elsewhere, Nguyen Van Thursday's unit prepared for their next move. Huddled in a hidden cave, they studied intelligence gathered from sympathetic villagers. "The French are spread thin," Tran Hong observed, tracing a route on the map. "We'll strike their weakest point and retreat before they can react." Nguyen admired his commander's calm determination, even as the constant danger wore on his own resolve. That night, the Viet Minh launched a surprise attack on a French supply depot. Explosions shattered the stillness, sending flames into the sky. The French scrambled to respond, but by the time reinforcements arrived, the attackers had vanished. Pierre arrived to find the depot reduced to smoldering ruins, his men's faces etched with exhaustion and anger. The war was becoming a battle of attrition, and the cost was mounting on both sides. The French forces relied heavily on local auxiliaries to navigate the unfamiliar terrain. These men, drawn from the region's villages, served as guides, scouts, and interpreters. Some were loyal to the French cause, while others harbored divided loyalties, secretly aiding the Viet Minh. Trust was a fragile commodity, and suspicion ran high within the ranks. Pierre Marchand's platoon was assigned a guide named Bao, a wiry man with sharp eyes and an easy smile. Bao led them through dense jungle paths, his machete slicing through the undergrowth with practiced ease. The soldiers trusted him grudgingly, knowing that betrayal could come from even the most unassuming ally. "Keep an eye on him," Pierre instructed his sergeant. "We can't afford any surprises." Unbeknownst to the French, Bao had been passing information to the Viet Minh. By day, he guided the French through the jungle. By night, he relayed their movements to Nguyen Van Thursday's unit. His double life was a perilous gamble, but Bao believed it was his duty to aid the fight for independence, even at great personal risk. The tension came to a head when Pierre's platoon was ambushed during a routine patrol. The attack was swift and precise, suggesting inside knowledge of their route. Bao's loyalty was immediately questioned, but he maintained his innocence with a convincing display of outrage. Pierre was torn. Was Bao a loyal guide or a cunning traitor? The uncertainty gnawed at him as he planned their next move. The dense jungles of Dong Bac had become a battleground not just for soldiers but for ideologies. For the French, it was a fight to maintain their colonial foothold in Indochina. For the Viet Minh, it was a struggle for freedom and sovereignty. The jungle itself seemed to take sides, its twisting paths favoring those who knew its secrets. Tran Huang's unit regrouped after their latest ambush, the soldiers buoyed by their small victory. Nguyen Van Thursday listened as his comrades spoke of their dreams for a liberated Vietnam. "One day, we'll walk these paths without fear," an older fighter said, his voice heavy with conviction. Nguyen nodded, though doubt lingered in his heart. Would the sacrifice ever end? Meanwhile, Pierre Marchand faced growing pressure from his superiors to deliver results. The French High Command demanded progress, but the jungle offered only frustration. Reports of Viet Minh movements were often vague, and every engagement seemed to end with the enemy slipping away. "We're fighting ghosts," one soldier muttered after another fruitless patrol. The villagers caught in the middle bore the brunt of the conflict. Families were displaced as the fighting encroached on their homes. Some fled deeper into the jungle, seeking safety in the unknown. Others remained, their lives dictated by the shifting tides of war. Mylene and her children clung to the hope that peace would return, even as the sounds of battle grew closer. As the weeks passed, cracks began to appear within both sides. The French soldiers, weary from constant skirmishes and the oppressive conditions, started to question the purpose of their mission. Morale dipped as stories of ambushes and casualties circulated through the ranks. Pierre struggled to keep his men focused, knowing that doubt was as dangerous as the Viet Minh. In the Viet Minh camp, tensions also simmered. The strain of constant movement and limited resources tested their unity. Nguyen Van Thursday observed a heated argument between Tran Hong and another commander over the next course of action. "We can't keep running," the other commander said. "We need a decisive victory." Tran shook his head. "Victory comes from endurance. The jungle is our ally, not the battlefield." Despite their differences, both sides shared a grim determination to press on. The jungle, indifferent to their struggles, continued to shape the course of the conflict. Every step was a reminder of the war's toll, not just on the soldiers but on the land and its people. The jungle at night was a living, breathing entity. Moonlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting shifting shadows on the forest floor. For the French soldiers, the darkness was a veil of danger. Every rustle of leaves could conceal an ambush, every distant sound was a warning. Pierre Marchand's platoon moved cautiously, their boots sinking into the damp earth. "Hold," Pierre whispered, raising a hand. The soldiers froze, their eyes scanning the shadows. A faint metallic sound, perhaps a rifle being adjusted, set their hearts racing. Moments later, a flare shot into the sky, illuminating the jungle in harsh white light. There, just beyond the tree line, the Viet Minh fighters lay in wait. Gunfire erupted, sharp and deafening in the still night. The French returned fire, their bullets tearing through the foliage. Nguyen Van Thursday crouched behind a tree, his rifle steady despite the chaos. He and his comrades had chosen this location carefully, knowing the terrain would allow for a quick escape. As the French advanced, the Viet Minh began their retreat, slipping into the shadows like phantoms. When the gunfire ceased, Pierre surveyed the aftermath. The ground was littered with spent shells, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke. They had driven off the attackers, but at a cost. 2 of his men lay motionless on the forest floor, their faces pale in the moonlight. Pierre clenched his fists, the weight of command pressing heavily on his shoulders. The Red River snaked through the jungle like a lifeline, its muddy waters offering both a means of escape and a route for supplies. For the Viet Minh, the river was a vital artery, connecting their scattered units. For the French, it was an obstacle to be controlled, its crossings carefully guarded. Mylene stood at the riverbank, her children clinging to her as she watched a group of Viet Minh fighters board a small wooden boat. Among them was Nguyen Van Thursday, his face tense with determination. The fighters carried sacks of supplies, rice, medicine, and ammunition, provided by sympathetic villagers. Mylene's heart ached with fear, but she said nothing, knowing her silence was an act of resistance. French patrol boats prowled the river, their searchlights sweeping the dark waters. On one such boat, Pierre Marchand leaned over a map, plotting their next move. "We'll intercept them at the southern crossing," he told his men. The tension in his voice betrayed his weariness. The river had become a battlefield, its currents carrying the hopes and fears of both sides. As dawn broke, a clash erupted near the crossing. The French boats opened fire on the Viet Minh rafts, their bullets splintering the wooden vessels. Nguyen and his comrades dove into the water, the cold shock stealing their breath. They swam for the far bank, their supplies lost but their lives spared. The river had claimed its toll, but the war continued. One morning, smoke rose over a small village near Thanh Nguyen. French troops, frustrated by the Viet Minh's elusiveness, had descended upon the settlement in force. Houses were searched, and anything suspected of aiding the insurgents was destroyed. For the villagers, it was a day of heartbreak and anger. Mylene stood at the edge of her home, clutching her children as soldiers tore through her belongings. "Where are they?" a French officer demanded, his voice sharp. Mai shook her head, her silence unwavering. The officer cursed and ordered the house burned. Flames consumed the wooden structure, the heat searing her skin. Tears streamed down her face, but she refused to break. Nearby, Nguyen Van Thursday watched helplessly from the jungle. He and his unit had hoped to protect the village, but the French forces had arrived too quickly. The sight of the burning homes fueled his resolve. "They think they can break us," Tran Hong said, his voice grim. "But the people's spirit will endure." That night, the Viet Minh launched a retaliatory attack on a nearby French outpost. The clash was fierce, the jungle echoing with the sounds of battle. By morning, the outpost lay in ruins, its defenders scattered. The message was clear, the Viet Minh would not be cowed. As the conflict dragged on, loyalties were tested in ways few could have imagined. Bao, the French guide with divided allegiances, found himself under scrutiny after another ambush. Pierre Marchand, still uncertain of Bao's true intentions, decided to confront him. "Who are you really working for?" Pierre asked, his tone cold. Bao met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "I am working for survival," Bao replied. "For my family and my village." It was not the answer Pierre wanted, but he knew it was the truth. In this war, survival often trumped ideology. Bao's dilemma was not unique. Many villagers and auxiliaries were caught between the French and the Viet Minh, their choices driven by necessity rather than conviction. Some turned to the highest bidder, others sought to protect their loved ones. Trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the brutal realities of war. For Nguyen Van Thursday, the concept of loyalty was simpler but no less burdensome. He fought for a free Vietnam, but he carried the weight of knowing his actions endangered the very people he sought to liberate. As he prepared for another mission, he thought of Mylene and her children, their faces etched in his memory. The war demanded sacrifices from all, and Nguyen feared he would never be free of its grasp. The jungle gave way to rolling highlands as the French forces pushed deeper into the region. The terrain became more treacherous, with narrow paths winding along steep ridges and valleys shrouded in mist. For Pierre Marchand and his men, the highlands were a new challenge. Visibility was poor, and the constant threat of ambush loomed over every step. The Viet Minh were well versed in the art of guerrilla warfare, and the highlands offered them a natural advantage. Nguyen Van Thursday's unit had relocated to this area, setting up hidden outposts along the ridges. From these vantage points, they could observe French movements and strike with precision. Nguyen had grown accustomed to the harsh conditions, his resolve hardened by weeks of fighting. One morning, Pierre's platoon encountered a heavily fortified Viet Minh position. The initial exchange of fire was fierce, the French advancing cautiously under the cover of artillery. The Viet Minh fought back with determination, their trenches dug deep into the hillside. Nguyen manned a machine gun, his hands steady despite the chaos. For hours, the battle raged, neither side willing to yield. By nightfall, the French had gained the upper hand, their superior firepower forcing the Viet Minh to retreat. The cost, however, was steep. Pierre surveyed the battlefield, his heart heavy as he counted the fallen. Among the Viet Minh, Nguyen and his comrades regrouped in the jungle, their numbers diminished but their spirit unbroken. The highlands had claimed its toll, but the fight was far from over. As the conflict wore on, information became a currency as valuable as weapons. Both sides relied on a network of informants, villagers, and spies to gain the upper hand. For the French, this often meant interrogating locals, while the Viet Minh relied on a loyal network of sympathizers who risked everything to pass along intelligence. Bao, the guide with divided loyalties, continued to walk a dangerous path. One night, he slipped away from the French camp and met with a Viet Minh contact in the shadows of a bamboo grove. "The French are planning to move east," he whispered, passing along the details of troop movements. The contact nodded, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. Back at the French camp, Pierre sensed something amiss. Reports of Viet Minh activity seemed too precise, their ambushes too well timed. "We have a lead," he told his sergeant, his voice tense. "Find out who it is." The suspicion that Bao was a traitor grew stronger, but without proof, Pierre was reluctant to act. For Nguyen Van Thursday, the information from Bao was invaluable. It allowed his unit to evade the French and strike when least expected. But Nguyen couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He knew that Bao's actions placed him in constant danger. "We're all risking everything," Tran Hong reminded him. "For our country, it's worth it." The Viet Minh strategy of attrition was taking its toll on the French forces. Supply lines were constantly under attack, and morale among the troops was at an all-time low. In one remote outpost, soldiers huddled in makeshift bunkers, their faces gaunt from exhaustion and lack of food. Letters from home brought little comfort. The jungle had a way of making the outside world feel impossibly distant. Pierre Marchand spent his nights reviewing maps and casualty reports, the weight of command bearing down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the operation was slipping out of control. "We're bleeding men and resources," he confided to a fellow officer. "How long can this go on?" Meanwhile, Nguyen Van Thursday and his unit faced their own hardships. Supplies were scarce, and the constant movement left them perpetually on edge. Despite the hardships, Nguyen found solace in the camaraderie of his comrades. They shared stories and dreams around small fires, their laughter a brief respite from the horrors of war. One day, a skirmish near a vital supply route left both sides battered. The Viet Minh succeeded in cutting off the French line, but at great cost. Nguyen watched as a close friend succumbed to his injuries, his blood soaking into the jungle floor. The sight hardened Nguyen's resolve. "We'll make them pay for every step they take," he vowed. Deep in the jungle, the Viet Minh maintained a hidden base where they coordinated their operations. The fortress, nestled in a network of caves and tunnels, was a testament to their ingenuity and resourcefulness. Here, leaders like Tran Hong devised strategies and rallied their troops. Nguyen Van Thursday felt a sense of pride as he entered the base. It was a hive of activity, with soldiers preparing weapons, medics tending to the wounded, and couriers delivering messages. The base was a stark contrast to the chaos of the battlefield, a sanctuary where hope was nurtured and plans were forged. The French, aware of the base's existence but not its location, intensified their efforts to find it. Reconnaissance flights and patrols scoured the jungle, but the Viet Minh's secrecy held firm. Pierre Marchand knew that discovering the base could turn the tide of the operation. "It's the heart of their resistance," he told his men. "If we find it, we can break them." The search for the base became a race against time. Bao, still feeding information to the Viet Minh, was instrumental in keeping its location hidden. His double life grew increasingly perilous, and he knew that one misstep could cost him everything. But his resolve, like that of the Viet Minh, remained unshaken. The monsoon season arrived with a vengeance, drenching the land in relentless rain. Rivers swelled, turning trails into muddy quagmires, and the jungle became a battlefield where nature itself seemed to conspire against both sides. The French soldiers slogged through the downpour, their spirits dampened by the unrelenting conditions. Pierre Marchand stood under the shelter of a tarp, watching as his men struggled to set up a temporary camp. The rain masked the sound of approaching footsteps, a constant reminder of the Viet Minh's ability to strike without warning. "We have to move quickly," Pierre said to his sergeant. "The jungle will swallow us if we let it." In the Viet Minh camp, Nguyen Van Thursday and his comrades faced their own challenges. The rain flooded their trenches and soaked their supplies, yet it also provided cover for their movements. Tran Hong gathered his men, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. "The French won't expect an attack in this weather," he said. "We'll use it to our advantage." The attack came at night, the storm masking the sound of advancing Viet Minh fighters. Nguyen moved with practiced ease, his rifle steady despite the slippery ground. The French, caught off guard, scrambled to defend their position. The clash was brief but fierce, with both sides retreating as the storm intensified. The jungle, shrouded in rain and thunder, seemed to hold its breath as the battle faded into the night. As Operation CEINTURE dragged into its fourth week, both sides began to feel the strain. For the French, the logistical challenges of operating in such hostile terrain became increasingly apparent. Supplies were running low, and every engagement drained their strength. For the Viet Minh, the constant movement and skirmishes took a toll on morale. My Linh, the villager caught between the warring sides, watched as her hamlet was reduced to ruins. The French soldiers had left, but their presence lingered in the form of burned homes and broken lives. Mai and her children scavenged for food, their once thriving village now a ghostly shadow of its former self. In a nearby clearing, Nguyen Van Thursday's unit paused to rest. They had lost several comrades in the latest ambush, their absence a stark reminder of the war's cost. Nguyen sat silently, his thoughts drifting to his family. He had not seen them in months, and the uncertainty of their fate gnawed at him. "We're all paying a price," Tran Hong said, sitting beside him. "But freedom is worth it." Meanwhile, Pierre Marchand faced mounting pressure from his superiors. The operation's success was measured not in territory gained but in the number of Viet Minh captured or killed, a metric that offered little solace in the face of mounting casualties. "We can't win like this," Pierre confided to a fellow officer. "Not here, not like this." Suspicion within the French ranks reached a boiling point. The ambushes had grown too precise, and Pierre could no longer ignore the possibility of a traitor in their midst. Bao, the guide, became the focal point of their doubts. Despite his outward loyalty, the officer's whispers cast a shadow over his every move. One evening, Pierre confronted Bao in private. "I need the truth," he said, his voice low but firm. Bao met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "I've done nothing to betray you," Bao replied. His words were calm, but Pierre could sense the fear beneath them. "Then prove it," Pierre said. "Help us find their base." Bao agreed, knowing the risk was immense. That night, he led the French on a long march through the jungle, his heart pounding with every step. He intentionally misdirected them, leading them away from the Viet Minh's hidden fortress. By dawn, the French had found nothing, their frustration boiling over. Pierre watched Bao closely, his suspicions unresolved. For Nguyen Van Thursday, Bao's actions were a lifeline. The guide's loyalty to the Viet Minh had bought them precious time, allowing them to prepare for the next phase of their campaign. "He's risking everything," Nguyen said to Tran Hong. "We owe him our survival." Tran nodded, his expression solemn. "And one day, he'll need us to do the same." By mid-December, Operation CEINTURE was nearing its end. The French had succeeded in driving the Viet Minh from key areas, but their hold on the region was tenuous at best. The jungle remained an untamed adversary, and the Viet Minh's ability to regroup and strike back was undiminished. Pierre Marchand stood before his men, his face lined with exhaustion. "This is it," he said. "Our last push. Let's make it count." The soldiers nodded, their expressions grim. They knew the operation's success would not bring an end to the war, but it might offer a fleeting sense of accomplishment. In the Viet Minh camp, Tran Hong delivered a similar speech. "The French think they've won," he said. "Let's show them they haven't." Nguyen Van Thursday felt a surge of determination as he prepared for the battle ahead. The stakes were higher than ever, and failure was not an option. The final clash came on December 21st, a brutal engagement that left both sides reeling. The French advanced with artillery and air support, their firepower devastating but imprecise. The Viet Minh fought with guerrilla tactics, striking swiftly and retreating before the French could counter. By nightfall, the jungle was littered with the detritus of war, broken weapons, torn uniforms, and the bodies of the fallen. On December 22nd, the French forces withdrew, leaving behind a scattering of jungle fortifications. The Viet Minh had been expelled from the region, but their resilience had not been broken. For Pierre, Nguyen, and countless others, the war continued, its end as elusive as the shadows that danced beneath the jungle's canopy. The story of Operation Papillon. The year was 1947, and the world was still reeling from the aftershocks of the Second World War. In the distant jungles of French Indochina, a new conflict was brewing, a clash of ideologies, power, and survival. The First Indochina War had erupted between the colonial French forces and the determined Viet Minh, a nationalist group fighting for Vietnamese independence. The French military command, under pressure to reassert its dominance, launched a daring offensive, Operation Papillon. Hoa Ben Province, nestled in the heart of the Indochinese jungle, became the focal point of this audacious plan. The French aimed to crush the Viet Minh stronghold in the region, leveraging their superior air power and ground forces. The operation's name, Papillon, French for butterfly, was meant to evoke elegance and precision. But the mission promised anything but grace. It was a calculated gamble in a war that was anything but predictable. French commanders meticulously planned the assault. Intelligence reports painted a picture of entrenched Viet Minh positions, their forces blending seamlessly with the dense terrain. The French hoped to deploy a combination of ground troops and aerial bombardments to dislodge the insurgents. Yet, the soldiers tasked with this mission knew the dangers. Stories of ambushes, booby traps, and relentless guerrilla tactics had filtered back from the front lines, casting a shadow over their morale. In the villages of Hoa Ben, the Viet Minh prepared for the storm they knew was coming. Farmers turned fighters fortified their positions, using every resource at their disposal. The dense jungle was their ally, concealing bunkers, trenches, and hidden supply lines. They were outgunned and outnumbered, but their resolve was unshaken. To them, this was not just a war, it was a fight for their homeland, their freedom, and their future. The French Air Force roared to life on a humid April morning, its squadrons of F-8F Bearcats slicing through the sky above Hoa Ben. The air assault marked the opening salvo of Operation Papillon, with the planes unleashing torrents of napalm on suspected Viet Minh positions. From the air, the jungle below seemed to ignite, plumes of smoke rising like ghostly sentinels. Pilots, clad in leather helmets and goggles, watched as the inferno spread, their hearts heavy with the weight of their mission. On the ground, the Viet Minh endured the onslaught. The airstrikes were devastating, but they had prepared for this. Underground tunnels shielded their fighters, and when the bombs stopped falling, they emerged, ready to retaliate. The jungle that had burned was still their domain, and they knew every tree, stream, and rock like the lines of their hands. Captain Marcel Fournier, a veteran of the French army, led one of the advancing columns. His orders were clear: secure the key supply routes and push deeper into enemy territory. Fournier was no stranger to war, but Indochina was unlike anything he had faced. The suffocating heat, the relentless insects, and the ever-present threat of ambush tested his resolve. As his column moved cautiously through the charred jungle, the silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of boots on scorched earth. Nearby, Nguyen Van Phuc, a young Viet Minh commander, watched the French advance from a concealed vantage point. He was only 25 but had already earned a reputation for his cunning and bravery. Fuck's heart pounded as he signaled his men to hold their fire. The French were stepping into a carefully laid trap, and he knew patience would be their greatest weapon. As Captain Fournier's men pushed deeper into the jungle, the tension was palpable. The air was thick with the smell of burnt foliage, and every shadow seemed to conceal danger. The French soldiers, veterans of many battles, moved with disciplined caution. Yet, the Viet Minh's silence unnerved them, a quiet reminder of their enemy's mastery of guerrilla warfare. Nguyen Van Phuc watched intently, his eyes narrowing as the French reached the heart of the kill zone. A subtle hand signal from him set the trap in motion. Hidden Viet Minh fighters sprang into action, their ambush erupting in a coordinated burst of gunfire and explosive charges. The jungle, which moments ago had been eerily still, exploded into chaos. Caught off guard, the French soldiers scrambled for cover. Captain Fournier barked orders, rallying his men amidst the cacophony of bullets and shrapnel. His training took over as he directed a counteroffensive, but the Viet Minh's knowledge of the terrain gave them a significant advantage. Every attempt to outflank them was met with resistance, and the jungle seemed to conspire against the French at every turn. For Phuc, the ambush was a success, but he knew better than to underestimate his enemy. The French fought back fiercely, and their air support loomed as a constant threat. As the firefight raged, Phuc made the difficult decision to withdraw his forces, preserving their strength for another day. The Viet Minh melted back into the jungle, leaving the French to count their dead and wounded. As dawn broke over Hoa Bang, the battlefield bore the scars of the previous day's clash. Charred trees stood as skeletal sentinels, and the acrid stench of gunpowder lingered in the humid air. French soldiers moved cautiously through the remnants of the ambush site, their nerves taut as they searched for survivors, traps, or signs of their elusive enemy. For Captain Marcel Fournier, the silence was as unnerving as the firefight had been. The Viet Minh had disappeared into the jungle, leaving behind only a few hastily abandoned weapons and supplies. To Fournier, it was clear they had been well prepared and highly disciplined. "They know this terrain better than we ever will," he muttered to his lieutenant, Etienne Moreau. Moreau, a younger officer with a sharp mind but little combat experience, nodded grimly. "They fight like ghosts, Captain." Miles away, Nguyen Van Phuc and his men regrouped in a concealed encampment. They tended to their wounded in the dim light of their underground tunnels, speaking in hushed tones to avoid detection. Despite their success in the ambush, Phuc's mind raced with the weight of what lay ahead. The French would not relent, he knew this. Their resources and firepower far outmatched the Viet Minh's, but Phuc believed in their cause. For every tree that burned, he vowed, 10 more would shelter his people. The French command, meanwhile, debated their next move. The ambush had shaken their confidence but not their resolve. General Jean-Pierre Armand, overseeing Operation Papillon, ordered an intensified campaign of reconnaissance and airstrikes. "We will root them out," he declared in a meeting of his officers. "If they vanish into the jungle, then we will burn the jungle itself." Operation Papillon's second phase began with a relentless barrage of airstrikes. F-8F Bearcats thundered across the skies, dropping napalm and high-explosive bombs on suspected Viet Minh positions. The jungle below erupted into flames, smoke rising in columns visible for miles. For the French pilots, the mission was clinical, their targets identified from reconnaissance photos and intelligence reports. But for the Viet Minh fighters on the ground, it was a nightmare of heat, fire, and chaos. Phuc and his men braved the inferno, using their network of tunnels to evade the flames. They had spent months preparing for such an onslaught, and their resilience was a testament to their ingenuity. Supplies were carefully hidden, and escape routes had been mapped out with precision. Yet, the relentless airstrikes tested even their hardened spirits. "Stay low, stay together," Fuck urged his men as they navigated the smoke-filled corridors of their underground refuge. For the French soldiers advancing on the ground, the jungle became an alien landscape. The air was thick with ash, and visibility was reduced to mere meters. Every step felt like a gamble, as the threat of booby traps and hidden enemies loomed large. Captain Fournier led his men with steely determination, though the strain of the operation was evident in his weary eyes. "This is no longer a war of men," he confided to Moreau one evening. "It's a war of the land itself." Despite the destruction, the Viet Minh adapted. They used the cover of night to move supplies and reposition their forces, evading the French patrols that hunted them. The jungle, though scarred, remained their ally, its shadows offering protection and its sounds masking their movements. The French had underestimated the resilience of both the land and the people who called it home. By the third week of April, Operation Papillon had devolved into a grueling war of attrition. The French forces, though better equipped, found themselves ensnared in the Viet Minh's web of guerrilla tactics. Supply lines were ambushed, communication posts sabotaged, and morale began to waver. For every inch of ground gained, the cost in blood and effort was staggering. In one particularly daring operation, a Viet Minh unit launched a nighttime raid on a French outpost near the river. Under Fuch's leadership, the fighters infiltrated the camp, neutralizing sentries with silent efficiency. Explosives were placed on key supply depots, and within minutes, the camp was engulfed in chaos. As the French scrambled to respond, the Viet Minh vanished into the night, leaving destruction and confusion in their wake. The raid sent shockwaves through the French command. General Armand, furious at the audacity of the attack, doubled down on his strategy. More troops were deployed, and local villages were subjected to harsh interrogations in search of Viet Minh sympathizers. Yet, these measures only deepened the divide between the French and the local population, many of whom now viewed the colonizers as oppressors rather than protectors. In the midst of this turmoil, a quiet bond began to form between Fournier and Moreau. The younger officer admired his captain's stoicism and tactical acumen, while Fournier saw in Moreau a spark of hope for the future of the French military. "This war will test you in ways you cannot imagine," Fournier told him one night as they shared a meager meal. "But it will also teach you what it means to endure." The jungle around Hoa Ben was alive with whispers, the sounds of nature interwoven with the quiet movements of soldiers. The Viet Minh had mastered the art of blending into the environment, their presence a constant shadow over the French forces. Captain Fournier, leading his column through a narrow valley, felt the oppressive weight of unseen eyes. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call seemed to carry a warning. The French troops moved cautiously, their boots sinking into the damp earth. The air was thick with humidity, clinging to their skin and uniforms. Fournier had instructed his men to stay alert, but exhaustion was taking its toll. They had been marching for days, their progress slowed by the need to clear traps and maintain constant vigilance. Despite their hardships, they knew turning back was not an option. The success of Operation Papillon depended on their perseverance. Meanwhile, Nguyen Van Phuc and his men monitored the French movements from a hidden vantage point. The jungle was their ally, its dense foliage providing cover and its sounds masking their whispers. Phuc's sharp eyes studied the French column, noting their formations and movements. "They're cautious," he murmured to his second-in-command, Lo Minh Tong. "But caution won't save them." Phuc's plan was simple yet effective. He would use the terrain to his advantage, drawing the French into a natural choke point where his fighters could strike with precision. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he gave the signal to prepare. The jungle would soon erupt once more, its shadows concealing the deadly dance of war. The French column halted as darkness fell, setting up a makeshift camp near the valley's edge. Fires were lit sparingly, their light casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. Soldiers sat in tense silence, their rifles close at hand. Captain Fournier reviewed the day's progress with Moreau, his voice low to avoid drawing attention. "We're close to their stronghold," he said. "I can feel it." But the Viet Minh had no intention of letting the French rest. As the night deepened, Phuc's fighters moved into position. Silent as the wind, they crept through the undergrowth, their dark clothing blending with the shadows. Each step was deliberate, each movement calculated. Phuc himself led the vanguard, his heart steady as he prepared to strike. The ambush began with a sudden burst of gunfire, shattering the stillness of the night. Viet Minh fighters attacked from multiple directions, their movements coordinated and precise. The French scrambled to respond, their camp erupting into chaos. Fournier barked orders, rallying his men as bullets whizzed past. The soldiers fought valiantly, their training evident in their disciplined maneuvers, but the Viet Minh's familiarity with the terrain gave them the upper hand. Moreau found himself separated from the main group, his heart pounding as he crouched behind a fallen tree. He clutched his rifle tightly, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a figure emerged, a young Viet Minh fighter, no older than Moreau himself. For a moment, their eyes met, each recognizing the humanity in the other. But the moment passed, and the fight resumed, each man driven by the forces that had brought them to this place. By dawn, the jungle was silent once more. The Viet Minh had withdrawn, leaving behind the remnants of their assault. The French had managed to repel the attack, but the cost was high. Dozens of soldiers lay wounded or dead, their lifeless forms a stark reminder of the price of war. Fournier walked among the fallen, his face a mask of grief and determination. "We'll bury them here," he said quietly. "And we'll honor their sacrifice." The survivors worked tirelessly to fortify their position, knowing the Viet Minh could strike again at any moment. Supplies were rationed, and patrols were doubled. Moreau, shaken but alive, approached Fournier as the captain studied a map. "We can't keep this up, sir," he said, his voice heavy with doubt. "They're wearing us down." Fournier placed a reassuring hand on the younger man's shoulder. "That's their strategy," he said. "But we're not beaten yet. We adapt, we endure, and we push forward." His words carried a weight that Moreau couldn't ignore, a reminder that resilience was their greatest weapon. Phuc, too, reflected on the night's events. Though the ambush had inflicted significant losses on the French, it had also cost his own forces dearly. He gathered his remaining fighters in a secluded clearing, addressing them with quiet resolve. "Every battle takes something from us," he said. "But it also gives us something, a chance to fight another day. And we will fight, until our land is free." As Operation Papillon entered its fourth week, the French forces found themselves entangled in a web of challenges. The jungle seemed to close in around them, its dense vegetation a constant obstacle. Supply lines were stretched thin, and the relentless heat sapped their strength. Yet, they pressed on, driven by orders and a desire to see their mission through. Fournier's column advanced cautiously, their movements deliberate and methodical. The soldiers spoke little, their focus on the path ahead. Each step brought them closer to their objective, and deeper into the heart of enemy territory. For many, the jungle had become a living entity, its shadows hiding both danger and mystery. Phuc, ever the strategist, observed the French advance with a mix of admiration and resolve. He knew the jungle as a mother knows her child, its secrets etched into his memory. Using this knowledge, he orchestrated a series of hit-and-run attacks, harassing the French while avoiding prolonged engagements. The jungle became his weapon, its twists and turns a labyrinth that only his fighters could navigate with ease. The clash between these two forces, the determined French and the resolute Viet Minh, turned Hoa Ben into a battlefield unlike any other. The outcome of Operation Papillon remained uncertain, its fate resting on the strength, strategy, and willpower of those who fought in its shadowed depths. The French forces, though battered, continued their advance deeper into Hoa Ben. Each step felt like a small victory, but every inch gained was accompanied by an escalating sense of vulnerability. The jungle's thick canopy seemed to loom closer, as if it sought to swallow them whole. For Captain Fournier, the operation had become a test of endurance as much as strategy. Scouts returned with reports of new obstacles, collapsed trails, hastily constructed barricades, and scattered remnants of the Viet Minh's presence. These signs, though subtle, told Fournier everything he needed to know. "They're leading us somewhere," he muttered to Moreau. The younger officer nodded, though his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. "And when we get there, they'll be waiting." The Viet Minh had indeed been preparing for the next stage of the battle. Nguyen Van Phuc had directed his forces to fortify a series of key positions near a narrow gorge that served as a natural choke point. The terrain, treacherous and unforgiving, was their greatest advantage. "Let them come," Phuc told his men, his voice calm but firm. "We'll make this place their grave." The French, unaware of the full extent of the danger ahead, pressed on. Morale was tenuously held together by Fournier's unyielding determination and the soldiers' shared sense of duty. Yet, in their quiet moments, many of them wondered how much longer they could endure the jungle's unrelenting hostility, and the enemy's unseen hand. The French column reached the gorge as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. The narrow pass was flanked by steep cliffs, their surfaces jagged and overgrown with vines. Fournier ordered his men to halt and establish a defensive perimeter. He studied the terrain with a practiced eye, his instincts warning him of the dangers it concealed. As night fell, the soldiers worked to fortify their position. Machine gun nests were established, and sentries were posted along the edges of the camp. The air was heavy with tension, every sound amplified by the oppressive stillness of the jungle. Fournier, unable to shake his unease, spent the night moving among his men, offering quiet words of encouragement. Phuc and his fighters watched from their concealed positions high above the gorge. The French were vulnerable, their defenses focused on the ground while the cliffs provided a perfect vantage point. Phuc knew the timing had to be precise. "Wait for my signal," he instructed his men. "Strike hard and vanish. Leave them no chance to regroup." In the dead of night, the Viet Minh launched their attack. Rocks and grenades rained down from the cliffs, followed by bursts of gunfire. The French camp erupted into chaos as soldiers scrambled to return fire. Fournier, caught in the middle of the fray, shouted orders to rally his men. The gorge became a maelstrom of sound and fury, the Viet Minh's superior positioning giving them a devastating advantage. The battle raged through the night, the narrow gorge amplifying the echoes of gunfire and explosions. The French soldiers, though disciplined, struggled to counter the Viet Minh's relentless assault. The steep cliffs turned every movement into a risk, and the darkness rendered their counterattacks blind and desperate. Captain Fournier fought alongside his men, his presence a beacon of resolve amidst the chaos. "Hold the line," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the din. His orders were met with determined efforts, but the Viet Minh's tactics continued to wear them down. Supplies ran low, and the wounded piled up in makeshift triage stations under the dim light of lanterns. By dawn, the Viet Minh withdrew, disappearing into the jungle as swiftly as they had attacked. The French forces, battered and bloody, were left to assess the damage. The gorge was littered with debris, and the cost of the engagement was evident in the faces of the survivors. Moreau approached Fournier, his expression grim. "We can't keep this up, Captain. They're bleeding us dry." Fournier's response was measured but firm. "We've come this far, Lieutenant. If we turn back now, everything we've lost will be for nothing." His words carried weight, but even he could feel the strain on his men. The jungle seemed to tighten its grip with every passing day, and the specter of defeat loomed ever larger. Though the French held the gorge, it was a hollow victory. General Armand, informed of the losses, ordered a strategic withdrawal to regroup and reassess. Fournier and his men were tasked with leading the retreat, their journey through the jungle now a race against time. The Viet Minh, emboldened by their success, pursued them relentlessly, striking at every opportunity. Phuc saw the retreat as a chance to press his advantage. His fighters harassed the French columns, targeting supply wagons and rear guards. Each skirmish further eroded the French morale, the jungle itself seeming to conspire against their escape. Yet, Phuc remained cautious, wary of overextending his forces. "We will let them go," he told Tom after one particularly brutal ambush. "But they will carry our message back with them, this is our land." For Fournier, the retreat was a bitter pill to swallow. His men moved in grim silence, their exhaustion and frustration palpable. Moreau, walking beside him, voiced the question on everyone's mind. "Was it worth it, sir? All of this?" Fournier's gaze remained fixed on the path ahead. "Ask me when we're home," he replied. "If we ever get there." The French retreat from Hoa Ben was anything but orderly. The jungle closed in around them, its dense vegetation a labyrinth that seemed to stretch endlessly. Every step forward felt like an uphill battle, the weight of the war pressing down on weary soldiers. Supplies were dwindling, and morale was at an all-time low. The constant threat of ambush turned every rustle of leaves into a harbinger of danger. Captain Fournier marched at the head of his column, his sharp eyes scanning the path ahead. The air was thick with humidity, making every breath feel like a laborious task. He could see the exhaustion in his men's faces, their once crisp uniforms now tattered and soaked in sweat. "Keep moving," he urged, his voice firm but weary. "The only way out is forward." Nguyen Van Phuc, meanwhile, observed the retreat from afar. He had instructed his men to maintain pressure without overcommitting. The French were retreating, but they were still dangerous. Phuc understood the value of patience. "Let them feel the weight of every mile," he told his second-in-command, Lo Minh Tom. "The jungle will fight with us." The jungle did, indeed, become an accomplice. Disease began to spread among the French ranks, with fevers and infections claiming as many lives as the Viet Minh's bullets. The once orderly columns became disjointed, stragglers falling behind and succumbing to the elements. For the French soldiers, it felt as though the jungle itself had turned against them. As the French forces neared the edge of the Hoa Ben region, they encountered one last obstacle, a narrow river crossing guarded by Viet Minh fighters. It was clear that the enemy intended to make a final stand, using the natural barrier to halt the French retreat. For Captain Fournier, the situation was dire. His men were exhausted, their ammunition running low. Yet, there was no choice but to fight. The Viet Minh had fortified their positions along the riverbank, constructing makeshift barricades and camouflaged firing points. Phuc himself oversaw the preparations, knowing that this battle could cement their victory. "Hold the line," he told his fighters. "Do not let them pass." At dawn, the French launched their assault. Mortar shells exploded along the riverbank, sending plumes of earth and water into the air. Soldiers waded into the river, their rifles held high as they faced a relentless barrage of gunfire. The Viet Minh, well hidden and disciplined, fired with deadly precision. The river became a scene of chaos, the water stained with blood as the battle raged. Fournier led from the front, rallying his men with unwavering resolve. "Push forward," he shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony. Moreau fought by his side, his youthful face hardened by the horrors of war. Together, they pressed on, determined to break through the enemy lines. The battle at the river crossing stretched into the afternoon, the sun beating down on soldiers from both sides. The French, though battered, refused to retreat. They used what little artillery they had left to pound the Viet Minh's positions, creating small openings for their infantry to advance. Yet, every step forward came at a steep cost. Phuc watched the French struggle, his heart heavy with the weight of command. He had lost many fighters already, their sacrifices etched into his memory. Still, he knew the importance of this battle. If the French broke through, they could regroup and return stronger. If they were stopped here, it would mark a decisive blow to Operation Papillon. Amid the chaos, Fournier spotted an opening. A section of the Viet Minh's defenses had been weakened by artillery fire, creating a narrow path through their lines. "This is it," he shouted to his men. "Follow me." With Moreau at his side, he charged forward, leading a desperate push to breach the enemy's position. The fighting was fierce and personal, soldiers grappling in the mud and water. The clash of bayonets and the crack of rifles filled the air. For every inch gained, another life was lost. Finally, after hours of brutal combat, the French broke through, forcing the Viet Minh to retreat. The riverbank was theirs, but the cost was staggering. As the sun set over the battlefield, the French soldiers surveyed the scene with a mix of relief and sorrow. Bodies lay strewn across the riverbank, the water running red with blood. Survivors tended to the wounded, their hands trembling as they worked. Fournier stood among them, his face lined with exhaustion. He had won the battle, but the victory felt hollow. Moreau approached him, his uniform soaked and torn. "We made it," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Fournier nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "This isn't over," he replied. "They'll be back." Phuc and his remaining fighters regrouped deeper in the jungle. Though they had been forced to retreat, their spirits remained unbroken. "We've shown them that we will not yield," Phuc told his men. "And we will fight again." Operation Papillon had reached its end, but its impact would reverberate for years to come. The French had failed to crush the Viet Minh, and the jungle of Hoa Ben remained a symbol of resistance. For both sides, the operation was a testament to the brutality and futility of war, a battle fought not just with weapons, but with the unyielding spirit of those who refused to surrender. The story of Operation Leah. Among the many battles and operations of the First Indochina War, one stood out for its audacity and scale, Operation Leah. Launched in October 1947, this French military campaign aimed to cripple the Viet Minh leadership by targeting their stronghold in Viet Bac. The operation would unfold as a story of daring airborne assaults, fierce jungle warfare, and the unyielding spirit of a people fighting for freedom. The early hours of October 7, 1947, were unusually still in the dense forests of Viet Bac. This region, nestled in the northern hills of Vietnam, had become a bastion for the Viet Minh. Here, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap, strategies for Vietnam's independence were planned, and guerrilla forces were trained. For weeks, rumors of a French offensive had whispered through the villages, carried by traders and sympathizers. Still, no one anticipated the scale of the storm about to descend. On the other side, General Jean-Étienne Vallée, commanding the French forces, finalized plans for Operation Leah. With 15,000 soldiers, including elite paratroopers, artillery, and riverine units, Vallée envisioned a swift strike to decapitate the Viet Minh leadership. Intelligence reports hinted that Ho Chi Minh himself might be hiding in the area. For Vallée, capturing him would be a decisive blow against the burgeoning independence movement. The operation's complexity reflected French desperation, combining airborne drops, ground assaults, and naval maneuvers in an attempt to encircle and annihilate the Viet Minh. As dawn broke, villagers in Bac Can, the provincial capital of Viet Bac, began their day in relative calm. Farmers tended to their rice fields, and children played by the rivers. Unbeknownst to them, the skies above were teeming with transport planes, their cargo holds packed with paratroopers. At precisely 7 a.m., the first wave of French soldiers leaped from their aircraft, their parachutes dotting the sky like blossoms unfurling in the morning sun. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Viet Minh were caught off guard, but their response was swift. Fighters scrambled to their positions, and messengers dashed through the jungles to alert nearby units. In the chaos, a young messenger named Jiung, barely 16, took it upon himself to warn a hidden camp deep in the jungle. His journey, fraught with peril, symbolized the resolve of a people who would not bow to foreign rule. Meanwhile, French troops secured key positions in Bac Can, their radios buzzing with reports of resistance and casualties. By nightfall, the first phase of Operation Leah was underway. The French had gained a foothold, but their ultimate objective, capturing the Viet Minh leadership, remained elusive. In the shadows of the jungle, General Giap and his commanders began plotting their counterattack. The battle for Viet Bac had just begun. As the initial shock of the airborne assault wore off, the French forces began to consolidate their positions around Bac Can. Paratroopers, wary of the thick jungle that surrounded them, moved cautiously through the terrain. The dense foliage was both a shield and a trap, concealing Viet Minh fighters who knew the land intimately. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every rustle of leaves a warning. The soldiers, though heavily armed, could not shake the sense of unease that hung in the air. In the command center established in Bac Can, General Vallée monitored reports coming in from various units. The first phase had gone largely according to plan. They had secured the town and disrupted some Viet Minh supply lines. However, the primary objective, capturing key leaders such as Vo Nguyen Giap, remained unfulfilled. Vallée ordered his forces to push deeper into the jungle, towards known Viet Minh strongholds. The French army's strength lay in its firepower, but in the dense forests of Viet Bac, that advantage was blunted. Meanwhile, General Giap was orchestrating a counteroffensive. He knew that a direct confrontation with the French would be suicidal. Instead, he relied on guerrilla tactics, ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and the use of the terrain to outmaneuver the enemy. Giap's men, many of whom were villagers armed with little more than outdated rifles and sharpened bamboo stakes, were fueled by an unshakable resolve to defend their homeland. Messages were sent to nearby units, calling for reinforcements and supplies. Every man, woman, and child in the region became part of the resistance. On the second day of the operation, a French patrol led by Lieutenant Pierre Duval ventured too far from the main force. They had orders to scout a suspected Viet Minh camp deep in the jungle. As they advanced, the undergrowth seemed to close in around them, the sounds of the jungle growing louder with every step. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a volley of gunfire. Hidden in the foliage, Viet Minh fighters launched a devastating ambush. Duval's men fought valiantly, but the jungle was not their ally. By the time reinforcements arrived, the patrol had suffered heavy casualties. The incident was a stark reminder of the challenges the French faced in this unforgiving environment. By nightfall, both sides assessed their positions. For the French, the jungle was proving to be an impenetrable maze. For the Viet Minh, every skirmish was a small victory, a testament to their resilience. The stage was set for a prolonged and grueling battle. The morning of October 9th brought heavy mist, cloaking the jungle in a scary shroud. French soldiers moved in tight formations, their fingers on their triggers, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. For many of them, this was their first experience in a tropical environment, and the constant humidity sapped their strength. Yet, they pushed on, driven by orders and a determination to achieve their objectives. Deep in the jungle, Nguyen Van Ton, a seasoned Viet Minh commander, prepared his men for another ambush. Ton had spent years fighting in these forests, learning to move like a shadow, to strike and disappear before the enemy could react. He knew the French were advancing towards a key supply depot hidden near the Non Sun River. Losing it would be a severe blow to the resistance. Ton divided his forces into small units, each tasked with harassing the French at different points along their path. The first encounter came near a narrow stream. A squad of French soldiers, crossing the water cautiously, was met with a sudden explosion. Ton's men had placed improvised mines beneath the shallow water, and the resulting blast threw the column into chaos. Gunfire erupted from the tree-line as Viet Minh fighters targeted the confused soldiers. The French managed to repel the attack, but their progress was significantly slowed. Every step forward came at a cost. At the same time, the French launched an assault from the air. Transport planes dropped supplies and reinforcements into designated zones, but the Viet Minh were quick to adapt. Ton's men targeted these drop zones, intercepting supplies and capturing weapons. For every setback, the Viet Minh found ways to turn the tide in their favor. The jungle became a battlefield where resourcefulness and ingenuity often trumped superior firepower. As night fell, the mist lifted, revealing a landscape scarred by the day's battles. The French forces regrouped, their spirits dampened but not broken. General Value issued new orders, urging his men to press on. The operation's success depended on maintaining momentum. For the Viet Minh, the day's skirmishes were a testament to their ability to resist, even against overwhelming odds. The jungle, their greatest ally, continued to shield them from the full force of the French army. As the French forces pushed further into Viet Bac, their focus shifted toward the strategic town of Chao Bang. General Value had identified this location as a potential stronghold for Viet Minh leadership. If Chao Bang fell, the French believed they could sever critical supply lines and force the Viet Minh into submission. However, the journey to Chao Bang was fraught with peril, with rugged terrain and ambushes lying in wait. For the soldiers of the 1st Parachute Chasseur Regiment, the advance was relentless. The thick canopy above blocked out much of the sunlight, leaving the jungle floor in perpetual twilight. Every step forward felt like venturing deeper into an unknown and hostile world. In their ranks, Corporal Jacques Lefebvre, a young soldier from Marseille, tried to maintain morale among his comrades. He often shared stories of home, hoping to distract them from the tension that gripped their every move. On October 12, the French column encountered one of its fiercest ambushes yet. Near a narrow mountain pass, Ton's Viet Minh fighters had prepared a deadly trap. As the French vehicles entered the pass, the lead jeep hit a hidden mine, triggering an explosion that echoed through the valley. Immediately, gunfire erupted from the cliffs above. The French scrambled for cover, returning fire as best they could, but the elevated position of the attackers gave the Viet Minh a significant advantage. In the chaos, Lefebvre found himself separated from his unit. Crawling through the underbrush, he stumbled upon a wounded comrade, Private Alain Dubois. Despite the risk, Lefebvre dragged Dubois to safety behind a large boulder. As bullets zipped past, Lefebvre realized the brutal reality of jungle warfare. Survival often depended on the courage and quick thinking of individuals. The ambush lasted hours, and by the time reinforcements arrived, the Viet Minh had melted back into the jungle. The French forces pressed on, but their losses were mounting. For every mile gained, they left behind comrades who would never return home. Chao Bang still lay ahead, and with it, the promise of more battles to come. While the French focused on their advance, deep within the jungle, General Von Nguyen Giap and his commanders strategized. They understood that the French goal was not just territorial but symbolic. The capture of Chao Bang would undermine the Viet Minh's image of invincibility. To prevent this, Giap planned a series of coordinated counterattacks to slow the French advance and inflict maximum casualties. In the village of Tuan Quang, a key supply hub for the Viet Minh, preparations were underway. Civilians worked alongside fighters to fortify the area. Women and children carried supplies, dug trenches, and prepared food for the troops. Among them was Lu Ti Hung, a schoolteacher turned nurse. Hung's days were spent tending to the wounded, her makeshift clinic a testament to the resourcefulness of the resistance. Though she had no formal medical training, her compassion and determination earned her the respect of everyone she treated. On October 15, the French reached the outskirts of Tuan Quang. Expecting little resistance, they were met with a ferocity that took them by surprise. The Viet Minh had transformed the village into a fortress. Barricades blocked the main roads, and snipers hid in the treetops, picking off advancing soldiers. The French deployed artillery to break through, but the dense jungle limited its effectiveness. Every advance was met with fierce resistance, and the village became a deadly maze of narrow paths and concealed traps. In the midst of the battle, Hung's clinic became a refuge for the injured. She moved tirelessly from one patient to the next, her hands steady despite the chaos outside. When a young fighter, barely older than a teenager, arrived with a severe leg wound, Hung made a split-second decision to amputate to save his life. Her actions epitomized the sacrifices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. By nightfall, the French had managed to breach Tuan Quang's defenses, but at a heavy cost. The village was left in ruins, its defenders retreating deeper into the jungle. For the French, it was a Pyrrhic victory, the cost of which weighed heavily on their morale. For the Viet Minh, the battle was a reminder of their strength and the sacrifices needed to continue their fight. The failure to capture key Viet Minh leaders in the early stages of Operation Leah forced General Valui to reconsider his strategy. The French forces had superior firepower, but the Viet Minh's mastery of the terrain and their guerrilla tactics nullified much of this advantage. Valui decided to divide his forces into smaller units, hoping to cover more ground and locate hidden strongholds. This change in tactics came with its own risks. Smaller units were more vulnerable to ambushes, and coordination became increasingly difficult in the dense jungle. The Viet Minh, however, adapted quickly. Tan, now bolstered by reinforcements, saw an opportunity to strike back. He ordered his fighters to focus on these smaller units, isolating and overwhelming them before they could regroup. One such unit, led by Captain André Morel, found itself deep in the jungle near Cho Dan. As they moved through a narrow valley, Viet Minh fighters unleashed a sudden attack. The French soldiers fought valiantly, forming a defensive perimeter and calling for air support. For hours, they held their ground, but the relentless attacks wore them down. By the time reinforcements arrived, Captain Morel's unit had suffered devastating losses. In the French headquarters, reports of such skirmishes painted a grim picture. The operation was progressing, but at a slower pace than anticipated. Valui remained determined, but the strain on his forces was evident. The jungles of Viet Bac were proving to be more than just a battlefield, they were an enemy in their own right. The French forces believed that capturing Ho Chi Minh would deal a crippling blow to the Viet Minh's morale and leadership. Intelligence reports suggested he was hidden somewhere in the labyrinthine jungles of Viet Bac, moving frequently to avoid detection. For General Valui, this was the ultimate objective of Operation Leah, to neutralize the figurehead of Vietnamese resistance. To this end, Valui ordered an elite reconnaissance team to spearhead the search. The team, led by Captain Etienne Garnier, was comprised of seasoned soldiers and Vietnamese informants loyal to the French. Their mission was fraught with danger, navigating enemy-controlled terrain where every villager could be a potential informant for the Viet Minh. The team's first lead came from a captured Viet Minh courier. Under interrogation, the courier revealed the existence of a hidden camp near the Non Sun River. Armed with this information, Garnier's unit set out, traveling under the cover of night. They moved silently through the jungle, their boots sinking into the damp soil, weapons at the ready. Garnier, a veteran of colonial campaigns in Algeria, knew the risks but was driven by the possibility of a decisive victory. By dawn, the team reached the outskirts of the suspected camp. What they found, however, was not Ho Chi Minh but an empty clearing, recently abandoned. The smoldering remains of campfires and discarded supplies indicated that the Viet Minh had been there just hours earlier. Frustration mounted among the soldiers, but Garnier kept them focused. He ordered the team to continue the search, aware that every delay gave the Viet Minh time to regroup. Meanwhile, Ho Chi Minh and his inner circle were constantly on the move. Guided by local villagers who risked their lives to aid him, Ho traversed narrow mountain paths and crossed swollen rivers to evade capture. His calm demeanor and steadfast resolve inspired those around him, even in the face of relentless pursuit. For Ho, the struggle was not just a battle for independence but a moral imperative to resist colonial domination. As the French continued their pursuit, the Viet Minh launched a daring counterattack to divert their attention. On October 20th, Viet Minh forces under the command of Colonel Hong Van Thai targeted the French-held town of Bac Camp. The attack was swift and coordinated, catching the French garrison by surprise. The assault began before dawn, with Viet Minh mortars raining down on French positions. Under the cover of darkness, Viet Minh sappers breached the town's defenses, clearing paths for infantry units. The French garrison, though outnumbered, fought fiercely to hold their ground. Lieutenant Henri Delacroix, commanding a section of the defenses, rallied his men, urging them to repel the attackers. His voice cut through the chaos, a steadying presence in the midst of the barrage. For hours, the battle raged. The Viet Minh used the element of surprise and their intimate knowledge of the terrain to devastating effect. French forces struggled to organize a cohesive defense, their communication lines disrupted by the attackers. In one corner of the town, a group of French soldiers was pinned down in a makeshift command post. Among them was Corporal Jacques Lefebvre, whose quick thinking helped save his unit during the ambush days earlier. This time, Lefebvre took charge, leading a small team in a desperate counterattack to reclaim a key intersection. By mid-morning, French reinforcements arrived, tipping the balance in their favor. Aircraft strafed Viet Minh positions, forcing the attackers to retreat. The town was secured, but the cost was high. Scores of soldiers lay wounded or dead, and the town itself bore the scars of the battle. For the Viet Minh, the attack was not a failure but a strategic maneuver to draw French attention away from other areas of Operation Leo. The Viet Minh's ability to mount counterattacks despite limited resources frustrated the French high command. Every victory seemed to come at a disproportionate cost, eroding the morale of the troops and stretching resources thin. General Giap, meanwhile, saw these skirmishes as part of a larger strategy to exhaust the French forces and turn the tide of the operation. One such counterattack took place near the village of Nari. French forces, attempting to secure the area, were ambushed by a Viet Minh detachment armed with captured French weapons. The ambush was a textbook example of guerrilla warfare. Viet Minh fighters emerged from hidden bunkers, firing on the exposed French troops before disappearing back into the jungle. The chaos left the French column in disarray, their vehicles stuck in muddy roads that had been sabotaged by local villagers. Among the Viet Minh fighters was a young recruit named Phan Van Loc, barely 18. Phan had joined the resistance after witnessing his family suffer under French rule. Despite his inexperience, Phan fought with determination, his courage inspiring those around him. During the ambush, he single-handedly disabled a French supply truck, cutting off reinforcements and earning the admiration of his comrades. By the end of the day, the French forces had been forced to retreat, leaving behind valuable supplies and equipment. For the Viet Minh, it was a morale-boosting victory that demonstrated their ability to resist even the best-trained French units. For the French, it was another reminder that their technological superiority meant little in the face of an enemy that knew the terrain and fought with unrelenting resolve. As October drew to a close, Operation Lea began to lose momentum. The French forces had secured several key towns and inflicted heavy casualties on the Viet Minh, but they had failed to achieve their primary objective, the capture of Viet Minh leadership. The dense jungle, the resilience of the local population, and the Viet Minh's adaptive tactics had blunted the effectiveness of the operation. For General Value, the campaign had become a test of endurance. Reports of skirmishes, ambushes, and supply shortages filled his desk daily. The strain on his men was evident in their faces and in their letters home. Yet, Value refused to admit defeat, ordering his forces to press on in the hope of achieving a breakthrough. In the Viet Minh camp, General Giap held a council with his commanders. They had managed to survive one of the largest French offensives of the war, but at great cost. Giap reminded his men that their strength lay not in numbers or weaponry but in their unwavering commitment to independence. The operation might not be over, but the Viet Minh's spirit remained unbroken. As the French sought to regain control of the Viet Bac region, the town of Cho Moi became a focal point in the campaign. Located along a critical supply route, Cho Moi was a lifeline for the Viet Minh, linking their mountain strongholds to the lowlands. For the French, its capture would deal a significant blow to the Viet Minh's logistical operations. General Value ordered a contingent of paratroopers, supported by armored vehicles, to secure the town at all costs. On November 1st, the French launched their assault. Troops descended upon Cho Moi with precision, using mortar fire to weaken the town's defenses before advancing on foot. However, the Viet Minh were prepared. Under the leadership of Colonel Hong Van Tai, they had fortified the town with trenches and barricades, transforming it into a stronghold. The narrow streets became choke points, where ambushes awaited the French forces at every turn. Captain André Morel, leading the paratroopers, recognized the difficulty of urban combat in such a constrained environment. He split his unit into smaller squads to clear buildings one by one. The soldiers moved cautiously, aware that each doorway could conceal a trap. As they advanced, they encountered fierce resistance. Viet Minh fighters, armed with rifles and grenades, fought from rooftops and alleyways, making every inch of progress a grueling battle. By nightfall, the French had taken control of the outskirts, but the town's center remained contested. Inside the Viet Minh headquarters, a determined Colonel Tai prepared his final line of defense. He instructed his fighters to hold their positions as long as possible, using the darkness to their advantage. The fighting continued into the night, with neither side willing to yield. The battle for Cho Moi raged into the early hours of November 2nd. The town's narrow alleys and dense jungle surroundings provided cover for Viet Minh fighters, who launched surprise attacks against the advancing French. The paratroopers, though well-trained, found themselves disoriented in the darkness. For every gain they made, the Viet Minh countered with equal ferocity. Corporal Jacques Lefebvre, now hardened by weeks of relentless combat, led a small squad tasked with securing a key bridge on the town's northern edge. The bridge was vital for French reinforcements and supplies to cross into the town. As Lefebvre's squad approached the structure, they were ambushed by a Viet Minh detachment lying in wait. Gunfire erupted, and the squad took cover behind the remnants of a collapsed building. Despite being outnumbered, Lefebvre's squad held their ground. Using their limited ammunition wisely, they managed to repel the attack long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The bridge was secured, but not without losses. Among the wounded was Private Alain Dubois, who had fought valiantly despite his injuries from an earlier skirmish. Lefebvre carried him back to safety, the weight of his comrade a stark reminder of the human cost of war. By dawn, the French had gained the upper hand. The remaining Viet Minh fighters, recognizing the futility of further resistance, retreated into the jungle. Cho Moi was in French hands, but the victory came at a steep price. The town lay in ruins, its streets littered with the debris of battle. As the French consolidated their hold on Cho Moi, the Viet Minh leadership withdrew deeper into the highlands. General Vuong Nguyen Giap, always a step ahead, directed his forces to regroup in more remote areas of the Viet Bac region. His strategy was clear: deny the French the decisive victory they sought by prolonging the conflict and forcing them into a war of attrition. The withdrawal was not without its challenges. Viet Minh units had to navigate treacherous terrain while evading French patrols and air reconnaissance. Along the way, they relied on local villagers for food, shelter, and guidance. The people of Viet Bac, many of whom had suffered under colonial rule, remained steadfast in their support of the resistance. They provided invaluable assistance, hiding supplies in caves and guiding fighters through secret trails. One such trail led through the rugged mountains of Chao Bang province. It was here that Lieutenant Phan Van Loc, a young officer in the Viet Minh, demonstrated extraordinary leadership. Tasked with leading a group of fighters to safety, Phan faced constant threats from French aircraft and ambushes. His calm demeanor and quick thinking earned him the respect of his men, many of whom were older and more experienced. By the time the group reached a hidden base, they were exhausted but determined. Phan's successful retreat was a small victory in the larger context of Operation Leah, a testament to the Viet Minh's resilience and resourcefulness. By mid-November 1947, Operation Leah was nearing its conclusion. The French had achieved several tactical victories, capturing key towns and inflicting heavy casualties on the Viet Minh. Yet, the operation's primary goal, neutralizing the Viet Minh leadership, remained unfulfilled. Ho Chi Minh and General Giap had eluded capture, and the Viet Minh's command structure was intact. In Paris, the French government hailed the operation as a success, emphasizing the disruption of Viet Minh operations and the recovery of territory. However, among the soldiers on the ground, the sentiment was far more subdued. Many had lost friends and comrades in the dense jungles of Viet Bac. The harsh conditions, constant ambushes, and unrelenting resistance had taken a toll on their morale. For the Viet Minh, Operation Leah was a defining moment. Though they had suffered significant losses, they had proven their ability to withstand the might of the French military. The people of Viet Bac, who had borne the brunt of the conflict, emerged more united in their resolve for independence. In hidden camps and remote villages, General Giap began laying the groundwork for the next phase of the struggle. As the French forces began to withdraw from the region, the jungle reclaimed the battlefields, erasing the scars of war but not the memories. Operation Leah had ended, but the First Indochina War continued, its outcome far from decided. The story of Operation Vulture. It was the spring of 1954, and the rugged hills of Dien Bien Phu, shrouded in mist, became the stage for one of the most significant confrontations of the First Indochina War. Deep in the heart of northern Vietnam, French forces had entrenched themselves in a valley they believed to be a stronghold. But unbeknownst to them, the Viet Minh, led by the brilliant General Vo Nguyen Giap, had been preparing for months to encircle and crush the French garrison. Operation Vulture, a proposed U.S. air intervention, hovered as a faint glimmer of hope for the beleaguered French. The outcome would not only shape the destiny of Vietnam but also influence global geopolitics for decades. In late 1953, the French military believed they had a masterstroke in Dien Bien Phu, nestled in a valley. The location was deemed perfect for establishing a fortified camp to cut off the Viet Minh supply routes to Laos. French commanders like Colonel Christian de Castries saw it as an opportunity to lure the Viet Minh into open battle, where French air superiority and artillery could decimate Giap's forces. However, Vo Nguyen Giap had other plans. Quietly, the Viet Minh mobilized an army of over 50,000 men and transported artillery pieces through dense jungle and treacherous terrain. These heavy guns were hidden in camouflaged positions on the surrounding hills, giving Giap's forces a devastating advantage. By the time the French realized the scale of the Viet Minh's preparations, it was too late. The once tranquil valley now stood on the brink of a siege. Supplies and reinforcements could only be delivered by air, and the French hoped their position would hold long enough for international assistance. Operation Vulture emerged as a contingency plan, a massive U.S. airstrike to relieve the garrison. Yet, in the shadowy world of Cold War diplomacy, even the possibility of American intervention faced intense scrutiny. On the evening of March 13, 1954, the Viet Minh launched their first major assault. Thunderous artillery fire lit up the night, tearing through French defenses and sowing chaos among the troops. The forward positions of Beatrice, Anne-Marie, and Gabrielle bore the brunt of the attack. Within hours, Beatrice fell, its defenders overwhelmed by relentless waves of infantry. Inside the garrison, panic spread. Colonel de Castries struggled to coordinate a response as communication lines failed under the barrage. The French artillery tried to retaliate, but their efforts were hampered by the precision and volume of the Viet Minh fire. For the French soldiers trapped in the forward outposts, the night was a harrowing ordeal. Survivors recounted the terrifying sound of shells screaming overhead and the cries of their wounded comrades. As dawn broke, smoke and the acrid stench of burning debris filled the air, revealing the devastation wrought upon the French positions. The Viet Minh's strategy was clear: isolate and systematically dismantle the French stronghold. For the defenders, the siege had just begun, and with each passing day, their hopes of relief dwindled. As the situation in Dien Bien Phu deteriorated, French leadership turned to their allies for assistance. On March 20th, General Paul Ely, the French Chief of Staff, arrived in Washington to plead for American intervention. In meetings with U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and Admiral Arthur Radford, the French made a desperate case for Operation VULTURE. The plan proposed a massive airstrike involving dozens of B-29 bombers from bases in the Philippines and Okinawa, supported by carrier-based fighters from the U.S. 7th Fleet. It was a bold and risky proposition, designed to break the Viet Minh siege and tilt the balance of the battle in France's favor. While some American military leaders, including Radford, were sympathetic to the plan, others were wary. President Dwight D. Eisenhower and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill were hesitant to commit forces to what they viewed as a potential quagmire. Without British support, Eisenhower refused to proceed, fearing the political repercussions of unilateral action. As Ely returned to Paris with uncertain assurances, the French forces in Dien Bien Phu continued to hold on, their fate increasingly dependent on decisions made in faraway capitals. The lifeline for the French garrison was the air supply operation, coordinated under harrowing conditions. Every day, planes from the French Air Force and American-operated civil air transport flew perilously close to Viet Minh anti-aircraft guns to drop desperately needed food, ammunition, and medical supplies. But by late March, the Viet Minh's artillery had tightened the noose around the drop zones. Colonel Jean-Louis Nicket, overseeing the aerial resupply, was forced to order higher altitude drops, which drastically reduced accuracy. Many supply crates landed in enemy territory, further bolstering the Viet Minh. Pilots faced harrowing odds, flying through flak and under the constant threat of being shot down. For the French troops on the ground, every successful drop was a small victory, but the growing shortages weighed heavily on morale. Each day, the Viet Minh artillery chipped away at their defenses, while inside the garrison, the strain of hunger, injuries, and exhaustion deepened. The siege dragged on, and with it, the hopes for a decisive intervention grew dimmer. As March gave way to April, the siege of Dien Bien Phu entered its most grueling phase. The French defenders were caught in a relentless cycle of bombardment and counterattack. Each night, the Viet Minh artillery rained shells onto the French positions, and each day, the French scrambled to repair their defenses. Casualties mounted on both sides. The French garrison hospital overflowed with wounded soldiers, many of whom suffered from infections due to inadequate medical supplies. The makeshift operating rooms became scenes of quiet agony, with medics working tirelessly under dim lights and amidst the constant rumble of distant shellfire. For the Viet Minh, the human cost was equally steep. Entire battalions were sacrificed in their attempts to overrun fortified French positions. Yet Giap's strategy relied on the ability to replace losses quickly. Supplies and reinforcements continued to pour in from hidden trails, often carried by civilian porters willing to risk their lives for the cause of independence. Despite the mounting losses, the Viet Minh's resolve never wavered. Each small victory, seizing an outpost, capturing supplies, brought them closer to their ultimate goal. Meanwhile, French morale sank under the weight of an increasingly hopeless situation. By mid-April, the French command at Dien Bien Phu faced a grim reality. Outposts like Gabriel and Anne-Marie had fallen, and the central garrison was becoming dangerously exposed. Each loss tightened the noose around the defenders, making resupply efforts more precarious. The French government, desperate for a solution, redoubled its efforts to secure American intervention. The political climate in Washington remained cautious, however. Although Admiral Radford and other military leaders continued to advocate for Operation Vulture, President Eisenhower remained firm in his stance. Without British support, the U.S. would not act. In London, Prime Minister Churchill expressed doubts about the wisdom of intervening in a conflict that could escalate into a wider war. He feared provoking China, whose support for the Viet Minh was already evident. The diplomatic impasse left the French increasingly isolated as the Viet Minh gained ground. Back at the garrison, the soldiers began to lose faith in a rescue that seemed less likely with each passing day. Yet, in the face of overwhelming odds, they continued to fight, their determination born of desperation and camaraderie. As the situation became more dire, the French implemented Operation Condor, a last-ditch attempt to disrupt the Viet Minh's artillery positions. French commandos launched night raids on the surrounding hills, targeting the well-concealed guns that had wreaked havoc on the garrison. These raids were perilous, requiring soldiers to navigate dense jungle terrain under the cover of darkness. Many of the commandos never returned, ambushed by Viet Minh forces or caught in deadly traps. Yet their efforts, though costly, provided brief reprieves for the beleaguered garrison, slowing the artillery barrages and allowing supplies to trickle in. Despite these temporary gains, the overall situation remained bleak. The French High Command in Hanoi received increasingly dire reports, with each dispatch painting a picture of a garrison on the brink of collapse. The pressure to succeed with Operation Condor grew, but even its architects knew it was a gamble against impossible odds. By late April, the siege reached its climactic phase. The Viet Minh launched a coordinated assault on the central French positions, aiming to break their defenses once and for all. Waves of infantry stormed the trenches, supported by relentless artillery fire. The French responded with everything they had, from machine guns to close-range artillery barrages. The battlefield became a nightmarish landscape of mud, fire, and shattered bodies. Yet, for every Viet Minh soldier who fell, another seemed to take their place. In the command bunker, Colonel de Castries issued frantic orders, trying to hold the line. But as the hours passed, it became clear that the garrison was being overwhelmed. The French defenders fought valiantly, but their lines buckled under the sheer weight of the Viet Minh assault. As dawn broke, the Viet Minh flag was seen flying over several captured French positions. It was a harbinger of the inevitable. The fall of Dien Bien Phu was no longer a question of if but when. Desperation gripped the French government as they made one last appeal to the United States. General Paul Ely once again pressed the case for Operation Vulture, arguing that a decisive airstrike could still save the garrison. The proposal even included the use of tactical nuclear weapons to break the siege. Yet, the response from Washington was tepid. The political risks of direct U.S. intervention remained too high, and the fear of provoking a broader conflict with China loomed large. Eisenhower reiterated his stance, and without British support, the plan remained grounded. In Dien Bien Phu, the soldiers clung to faint hopes of relief. As the Viet Minh tightened their grip, stories of heroism and sacrifice emerged. Soldiers shared rations, carried wounded comrades, and manned their posts with stoic determination. They fought not only for survival but also to honor their fallen brothers in arms. On May 7, 1954, after 56 days of relentless siege, the garrison at Dien Bien Phu finally capitulated. Exhausted, starving, and out of ammunition, the French forces had no choice but to surrender. The Viet Minh swept into the garrison, capturing thousands of prisoners, including Colonel de Castries and his senior officers. The fall of Dien Bien Phu marked a decisive victory for the Viet Minh and a devastating blow to French colonial ambitions in Indochina. For the soldiers who survived, the end of the battle was a bitter relief, their ordeal replaced by the uncertainty of captivity. The echoes of this battle would reverberate far beyond the jungles of Vietnam. It signaled the end of French rule in Indochina and set the stage for the Geneva Accords, which divided Vietnam and laid the groundwork for the conflict that would later draw the United States into a protracted war. The immediate aftermath of the fall of Dien Bien Phu was one of devastation and reflection. French prisoners, numbering over 10,000, were marched on foot through the dense jungles to Viet Minh camps. Weak and wounded soldiers endured grueling conditions, many would not survive the long journey. The Viet Minh's treatment of their captives reflected the harsh realities of war, where medical care and food were scarce even for their own forces. For the French military and political leadership, the loss was a humiliation. Newspapers in Paris carried headlines of defeat, sparking debates in the National Assembly. The illusion of French superiority in Indochina was shattered, and the nation's colonial ambitions stood at a crossroads. Meanwhile, in the Viet Minh camps, the victory was celebrated with somber pride. Soldiers reflected on their comrades who had fallen, while Giap and his commanders began planning their next steps in the broader struggle for independence. The triumph at Dien Bien Phu was a powerful symbol, but the fight for Vietnam's future was far from over. As historians and military analysts began dissecting the events at Dien Bien Phu, Operation Vulture's failure to materialize became a focal point. The plan, which had promised to deliver massive U.S. air support, now seemed like a missed opportunity, an unrealized intervention that could have changed the course of the battle. The French had placed immense hope in the proposed air campaign, envisioning waves of B-29 bombers breaking the Viet Minh siege. Yet the diplomatic realities of the Cold War prevented it from becoming a reality. Eisenhower's administration remained wary of escalating the conflict into a direct confrontation with China, especially without British support. Within the fortified command bunkers of Dien Bien Phu, the mood was one of grim determination mixed with growing despair. Colonel de Castries and his officers had fought valiantly to hold the garrison together, but the relentless Viet Minh bombardment took its toll. Through detailed accounts, the listener is transported into the cramped, dimly lit spaces where crucial decisions were made. The psychological toll of the siege becomes palpable, showing the human side of a battle often reduced to statistics and strategy. One of the defining challenges of Dien Bien Phu was the difficulty of resupply. French forces depended entirely on airlifts for food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Flying through narrow valleys and under constant fire from Viet Minh anti-aircraft guns, these aviators became unsung heroes of the battle. Each successful drop was a testament to their skill and bravery, yet the increasing altitude required for safe flights resulted in many supply crates falling into enemy hands. Eisenhower's administration weighed the risks of direct involvement against the growing communist threat in Southeast Asia. Churchill's government, haunted by the recent memory of World War II, hesitated to commit to another costly conflict. Meanwhile, French leaders felt abandoned, their pleas for support falling on deaf ears. Under the cover of darkness, thousands of Viet Minh soldiers moved into position. Artillery bombardments softened the French defenses, paving the way for infantry to storm the trenches. The fighting was brutal, with both sides suffering heavy casualties in hand-to-hand combat. The French fought fiercely, but their lines could not hold against the sheer numbers and determination of the Viet Minh. By dawn, key positions had fallen, and the garrison was in disarray. With the battle over, the surviving French soldiers faced a new ordeal as prisoners of war. Yet even in captivity, stories of resilience and solidarity emerged. Prisoners supported one another, sharing meager rations and maintaining hope through shared memories of home. These personal accounts shed light on the enduring human spirit in the face of unimaginable hardship. In the months following the fall of Dien Bien Phu, military analysts and historians scrutinized the events leading up to the French defeat. Operation Vulture was a key point of contention, an ambitious plan that could have provided a lifeline but remained grounded due to diplomatic hesitations. Though never executed, Operation Vulture demonstrated the limits of air power in conflicts shaped by guerrilla tactics and complex terrain. For French officials, it symbolized their reliance on external support, while for American leaders, it reinforced the dangers of entanglement in Southeast Asia without clear strategic objectives. In hindsight, the failure of Operation Vulture served as a harbinger for future conflicts, particularly the Vietnam War. It highlighted the delicate balance between military intervention and political calculation, a lesson that would weigh heavily on U.S. decision-making in the decades to come. For the French, the experience was one of isolation and constant fear. The sound of incoming shells became a daily torment, and every trip to the front line was a gamble with death. Yet amidst the chaos, camaraderie flourished. Soldiers shared cigarettes, swapped stories, and leaned on each other to endure the unrelenting pressure. For the Viet Minh, the battle represented the culmination of years of struggle against colonial rule. Many fighters were young and inexperienced, but their resolve was unshakable. They faced immense hardships, shortages of food, medical supplies, and even basic equipment, but their belief in the cause of independence kept them going. These personal accounts add a human dimension to the broader narrative, showing the courage, fear, and sacrifice that defined the siege. Air power played a crucial yet paradoxical role in the siege of Dien Bien Phu. While the French relied heavily on airdrops to sustain their garrison, the Viet Minh's anti-aircraft capabilities proved devastatingly effective. While the battle raged on, diplomatic efforts to secure international intervention reached a fever pitch. French diplomats, led by Paul Ely, continued to push for American assistance, but the lack of British support stalled any potential action. Churchill's government remained cautious, wary of provoking another major conflict so soon after World War II. In the U.S., Eisenhower faced pressure from hawkish advisors but remained steadfast in his refusal to act without Allied backing. The diplomatic stalemate underscored the complexities of Cold War alliances. It also revealed the shifting balance of power, as France's colonial ambitions increasingly clashed with the strategic priorities of its allies. As the siege dragged on, the hills surrounding Dien Bien Phu became symbols of resistance and sacrifice. The French understood the importance of these high grounds, but the Viet Minh's superior positioning and relentless assaults made their defense nearly impossible. Each hill became a microcosm of the larger conflict, with soldiers enduring intense shelling and wave after wave of attacks. For the French, holding these positions was a matter of survival. For the Viet Minh, capturing them was a step closer to victory. The hills bore witness to some of the most brutal fighting of the siege, with heavy casualties on both sides. By early May, the situation in Dien Bien Phu was untenable. French positions were crumbling, and supplies were nearly exhausted. Colonel de Castries and his commanders faced the grim reality that surrender was their only option. For the Viet Minh, the sight of French troops surrendering was a powerful vindication of their struggle. The victory at Dien Bien Phu would become a rallying cry for anti-colonial movements worldwide. Following their surrender, the French prisoners began a grueling march to Viet Minh detention camps. Deprived of adequate food and water, many prisoners succumbed to exhaustion and disease. Yet, amidst the suffering, acts of kindness emerged, be it Minh guards sharing their meager rations, or French soldiers helping their wounded comrades. The march became a test of endurance and resilience, reflecting the broader hardships of war. For those who survived, it was an experience that would haunt them for the rest of their lives.